Hello everyone. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time it is. That way YouTube will keep pulling you stories like this. Now let the shadows take over. They say nothing good happens after 2 a.m., but for those who work the graveyard shift, 2 a.m. is just the beginning. These 7 true night shift horror stories will make you grateful you sleep when the sun goes down. I worked security at an office building in downtown Minneapolis for 3 years. It was one of those sterile corporate towers with 40 floors of cubicles, conference rooms, and the occasional executive office with floor-to-ceiling windows. During the day, the place buzzed with activity. But after 10 p.m., when the last of the cleaning crew finished their rounds, it became something else entirely. My shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. The first few months were routine. I'd walk the floors every 2 hours, check the doors, make sure the fire exits were clear. The building had motion sensors that would ping my security desk if anything moved after hours, but they rarely went off. Occasionally a pigeon would trigger one on the roof, or a cleaning cart someone forgot to secure would roll into a hallway. Nothing unusual. That changed in October. I was doing my 1 a.m. rounds on the 23rd floor when I heard typing. The sound was distinct, rhythmic, like someone working late at their desk. I stopped in the middle of the hallway listening. The typing continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. I called out, "Hello? Is someone still here?" Silence. I walked toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness between the cubicles. When I reached the area where I thought the typing had come from, all the desks were empty. Computers off, chairs pushed in, everything exactly as it should be. I chalked it up to the building settling or maybe sound carrying from somewhere else. But the next night, it happened again. Same time, same floor, same rhythmic typing. This time I moved faster, practically jogging to the source of the sound. Again, nothing. By the 4th night, I was convinced someone was pranking me. Maybe another security guard from the day shift had hidden a small speaker somewhere, or there was some technical malfunction I wasn't aware of. I decided to position myself on the 23rd floor before 1 a.m. and wait. At 12:58 a.m., I crouched behind a cubicle wall with a clear view of the section where the typing always seemed to originate. The building was dead silent except for the hum of the VFX system. Then, exactly at 1 a.m., it started. But this time, I could see it. In the cubicle directly across from me, someone was sitting at the desk, typing. The figure was hunched over the keyboard, fingers moving rapidly across the keys. The computer screen wasn't on, but the person kept typing as if they could see what they were writing. I couldn't make out any details in the darkness, just the silhouette of someone in business clothes, maybe a tie, short hair. The typing was so fast it sounded almost mechanical. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering, and called out again. "Excuse me, you're not supposed to be here after hours." The typing stopped immediately. The figure straightened up, turned toward me, and that's when I saw the face. Or rather, where the face should have been. It was smooth, blank, like looking at a mannequin head that had never been painted. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth. Skin the color of old paper. I stumbled backward, knocking over a trash can. The sound echoed through the empty floor. When I looked back up, the figure was gone. I ran to the elevators, rode down to the lobby, and called my supervisor. I told him there was an intruder in the building and that he needed to call the police immediately. Within 20 minutes, 3 squad cars were outside, and officers were searching every floor. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been in the building who wasn't supposed to be there. The security cameras showed only me walking the halls. But when we reviewed the footage from the 23rd floor at 1 a.m., there was something that made my blood run cold. The camera clearly showed me crouched behind the cubicle wall, then standing up and speaking to empty air. But just for a moment, maybe 3 frames of video. There was a dark shape at the desk across from me. Too brief to make out details, but definitely there. The police filed a report, but there wasn't much they could do. My supervisor suggested I might have been overtired, that night shift work can play tricks on your mind. I wanted to believe that. The next night, I almost called in sick, but I needed the job, and part of me had to know if it would happen again. It did. Same time, same floor. But this time, when I went to investigate, there were words on one of the computer screens. The monitor was on now, displaying a document in what looked like a word processor. The text was simple, repeating over and over. He stays late, he works alone. He stays late, he works alone. He stays late. The cursor was still blinking at the end of the last line. Backed away from the computer and immediately called building management. They had someone come in the next day to check all the systems, run diagnostics, look for any technical problems that might cause computers to turn on by themselves or display text. Everything came back normal. But the facility manager mentioned something that stuck with me. About 6 months before I started working there, another security guard had quit suddenly in the middle of a shift. He'd called in saying there was something wrong with the building and he wouldn't be coming back. They never got a detailed explanation. I started doing some research. It took weeks, but I eventually tracked down the guard who'd quit. His name was Marcus, and he agreed to meet me at a diner across town. Marcus looked like he hadn't slept well in months. Dark circles under his eyes, hands that shook slightly when he picked up his coffee cup. When I told him about the typing and the figure on the 23rd floor, he went pale. "You saw him too," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Did you ever wonder why that particular cubicle always seemed to be the center of it?" he asked. I hadn't actually. I'd been so focused on the impossible fact of what I was seeing that I hadn't thought about the location. Marcus pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was a printout of a news article from 7 years ago. The headline read, "Local accountant found dead at desk after working 60-hour week." The article was about a man named David Chun, 34, who had been found dead at his desk on a Monday morning by coworkers. He'd apparently worked through the entire weekend on a project with an impossible deadline, sustaining himself on coffee and vending machine snacks. The coroner ruled it a heart attack brought on by stress and exhaustion. The article mentioned the company name, the floor number, and even the specific cubicle where he'd been found. 23rd floor, northwest corner. The same area where I'd been seeing the typing figure. David never left, Marcus said. Even after they carried his body out, cleaned out his desk, reassigned his projects. He's still there, still trying to meet that deadline. Still working. I stared at the article, my hands trembling slightly. "How do you know all this?" "Because I worked there for almost a year before you did. Same thing, every night. The typing, the figure, sometimes words on the computer screen. Always work-related stuff, project updates, memos. Like he's still trying to finish whatever he was working on when he died." Marcus leaned forward. "The worst part isn't seeing him. It's what happens if you try to stop him." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "One night, about 3 weeks before I quit, I decided I'd had enough. I walked right up to his desk while he was typing and put my hand on the keyboard. I told him he needed to rest, that the work wasn't worth it, that he was dead and needed to move on." Marcus paused, staring into his coffee. He turned and looked at me with that blank face, and suddenly, I could see what killed him. The stress, the pressure, the impossible demands. It was like drowning in someone else's desperation. I felt my chest tighten, my heart start racing. For a few seconds, I thought I was going to die right there, just like he did. I left my job. The next week, I couldn't handle another night of watching David Chen work himself to death over and over again, trapped in an endless loop of overtime that would never be enough. But sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I Wonder if he's still there. Still typing in the darkness. Still trying to meet a deadline that doesn't matter anymore. Still working the night shift in a job that killed him once and won't let him go. Asterisk. Working as a night custodian at Mercy General Hospital was supposed to be simple. Clean the floors, empty the trash, restock supplies, and try not to think too hard about what happens in hospitals after visiting hours end. I'd been on the job for about 6 months when I learned that some patients never really leave. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and I was responsible for the 3rd through 6th floors. The 3rd floor was pediatrics, which was usually quiet except for the occasional crying child or worried parent sleeping in an uncomfortable chair. The 4th and 5th floors were general medicine, and the 6th was the cardiac unit. The hospital at night has a different energy than during the day. It's quieter, but never truly silent. There's always the hum of machines, the soft beep of monitors, the whispered conversations of nurses making their rounds. You get used to it, or at least I thought I did. The first strange thing I noticed was on the 4th floor. I was mopping the hallway around 2 a.m. when I heard someone walking behind me. Not unusual, except when I turned around, the hallway was empty. I figured it was just a nurse and soft-soled shoes who had ducked into a patient room, so I continued working, but as I moved down the hall, the footsteps followed. Always about 10 feet behind me, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I started again, they resumed. I tried to ignore it for a few nights, but the sound was so distinct and consistent that it became impossible to dismiss. One night I decided to confront whatever was following me. I stopped in the middle of the hallway, turned around quickly, and called out softly, "Can I help you?" Nothing. But for just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, I could swear I saw a figure in a hospital gown at the far end of the hall. Tall, thin, moving with the slow, uncertain gait of someone recovering from surgery. When I blinked, the figure was gone. I mentioned it to Carol, one of the night nurses, during my break. "Oh, you met Harold," she said with a knowing smile. Harold Kemper. He was a patient here about 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Spent his last 3 months in room 412. Poor man used to walk the halls for hours when he couldn't sleep, dragging his 4-pole behind him. Drove the night staff crazy because he'd shuffle around until dawn. I felt a chill. Room 412 was exactly where I'd first noticed the footsteps. What happened to him? Died in his sleep one Tuesday morning around 4 a.m., peaceful, according to the doctor. But double quotes. Carol paused, glancing down the hallway. But what? Well, we still hear him sometimes. The footsteps, that distinctive shuffle. And occasionally, patients in 412 complain about an old man wandering around their room at night, checking on them like he's worried about something. I thought Harold sounded harmless enough, maybe even comforting in a strange way. A ghost who cared about other patients seemed like the kind of spirit you could coexist with. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I was working the 6th floor when I heard screaming from one of the rooms. Not the controlled, medical emergency kind of screaming that happens when someone is in pain. This was pure terror, the sound of someone who had seen something that broke their understanding of reality. I ran toward the sound and found a patient in room 618 sitting up in bed, pointing at the corner of his room and crying. He was maybe 60, in for a heart procedure, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. "He's there," the patient gasped, pointing to an empty corner. "The old man in the gown, he keeps staring at me, he won't leave." I looked. Where he was pointing, nothing. A nurse arrived, and together we tried to calm the patient down. He insisted that an elderly man in a hospital gown had been standing in his room for the past hour, just watching him. Not moving, not speaking, just staring with eyes that looked dead and hungry. The nurse administered a mild sedative, and the patient eventually fell asleep. But before he drifted off, he grabbed my arm and whispered, "He's not trying to help people, he's looking for something. And he's angry, he can't find it." Over the next few weeks, the incidents escalated. More patients reported seeing the old man in their rooms. Always the same description: tall, thin, hospital gown, vacant eyes. But the reports were getting darker. Patients said he would stand at the foot of their beds for hours, sometimes reaching toward them with skeletal fingers. Others reported waking up to find their blankets pulled off, their forelines twisted, their call buttons moved just out of reach. One woman in room 615 claimed the old man had whispered to her, "You're in my spot. This is where I died." But room 615 wasn't Harold's room. That was 412. I started to suspect that whatever was haunting the hospital wasn't the kindly Harold that Carol had described. Either Harold had changed, or something else was pretending to be him. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in November. I was on the 4th floor, emptying trash bins, when I heard the familiar footsteps behind me. But this time, they were faster, more aggressive. Instead of the slow shuffle of a sick man, these sounded purposeful, almost predatory. I turned around and saw him clearly for the first time. He was wearing a hospital gown, and he was tall and thin as the patients had described. But this wasn't a confused ghost wandering the halls out of habit. His face was twisted with rage, his mouth open in a silent scream. His eyes weren't vacant. They were furious, scanning the hallway like he was hunting for something. And he was looking directly at me. He started moving toward me, not shuffling now but walking with swift, determined steps. I backed toward the elevator, but he was closing the distance fast. As he got closer, I could see that his hospital gown was stained with something dark, and his skin had a gray, mottled appearance. I reached the elevator and frantically pressed the call button. The ghost was maybe 20 feet away when the doors opened. I threw myself inside and hammered the close button, watching through the narrowing gap as the figure approached. Just before the doors shut completely, I heard him speak. His voice was a harsh whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "This is my hospital. These are my rooms. These are my patients." I rode the elevator down to the 1st floor and sat in the lobby for the rest of my shift, too shaken to go back upstairs the next morning. I talked to the head nurse about Harold Kemper. I asked about his death, his personality when he was alive. Anything that might explain what I'd experienced. She looked confused. "Harold Kemper? I don't recall any patient by that name. Are you sure you have the right person?" I described what Carol had told me about the man who died in 412, and the head nurse shook her head. "Room 412? That room's been empty for renovation since I started working here 3 years ago. Water damage from a pipe burst. We've never had long-term patients in that room." I found Carol later that day and asked her about Harold again. She looked at me strangely. "I never told you about anyone named Harold," she said. "I think you might be confusing me with someone else." But I remembered our conversation clearly. Every word. I started researching the hospital's history, looking through old records, obituaries, anything that might give me information about who or what was haunting the building. What I found was worse than a confused ghost. 7 years ago, there had been a night custodian named Harold Kemper. Not a patient, but an employee. He'd worked the same shift I was working now, same floors, same routine. One morning, he was found dead in a supply closet on the 4th floor. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but there were complications. Harold had been stealing medications from the hospital pharmacy for months. Pain pills, sedatives, anything he could sell on the street. The night he died, he'd apparently taken some of the stolen pills himself and overdosed in the supply closet. But here's the part that made my skin crawl. Harold had been stealing from dying patients. He would wait until someone was close to death, then take their prescribed medications before they could use them. Nurses thought it was a clerical error or that medications were being miscounted. Several patients died in more pain than they should have because Harold had stolen their morphine, their anxiety medication, their final comfort in the last hours of life. And now he was back, angry and possessive, claiming the hospital as his territory and the patients as his victims. I quit the next day. But before I left, I told the head nurse everything. She didn't believe the ghost story, but she did take seriously my concerns about the patients who were reporting nighttime disturbances. They moved several patients to different floors and brought in a chaplain to bless the rooms that had been affected. I heard from Carol a few months later that the incidents had stopped after they cleared out the old supply closets and found Harold's stash of stolen medications hidden behind boxes of cleaning supplies. Apparently, removing his stolen goods was enough to put him to rest, but I still think about those patients, alone in their beds at night, visited by someone who saw them not as people in need of healing, but as opportunities for theft. The night shift has a different energy, and sometimes the darkness brings out the worst in people, even after they're dead. The Riverside manufacturing plant made automotive parts, and it ran 3 shifts to keep up with demand. I worked the graveyard shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., operating one of the stamping machines that pressed raw steel into brake components. It was loud, hot, dangerous work, but it paid better than anything else I could get with just a high school diploma. The factory floor during the night shift was a different world. Only about a third of the machines were running, so there were huge sections of the building that sat in darkness. The day shift employed maybe 200 people, but at night there were only about 30 of us spread across a facility the size of 2 football fields. I've been working there for almost a year when Jimmy Torino died. Jimmy was a good guy, maybe 55, with 2 daughters in college and a wife who packed him the same bologna sandwich every night for 15 years. He operated the machine next to mine, a hydraulic press that shaped fender brackets. Jimmy was obsessive about safety, always checking his equipment twice, never taking shortcuts. That's why what happened to him was so shocking. It was a Tuesday night in March, around 3 a.m., when we heard the scream. Not a yell or a shout, but a scream of pure agony that cut through the noise of the machines and made everyone stop what they were doing. Jimmy's press had malfunctioned somehow. The safety guards had failed, the emergency stops didn't work, and his right arm had been caught in the mechanism. By the time we got the power shut off and the machine stopped, the damage was done. The paramedics did everything they could, but Jimmy died on the way to the hospital from blood loss and shock. The company shut down for 3 days while OSHA investigated, but they couldn't determine what had caused the multiple safety systems to fail simultaneously. The press was old, but it had been inspected just 2 months earlier and passed all its safety checks. Jimmy's funeral was on a Saturday, and most of the night shift attended. His wife spoke about how much he loved his job, how proud he was of the work he did, how he always said the factory was like a second home to him. We came back to work the following Monday. Jimmy's machine sat silent and locked out, waiting for a replacement operator and a full mechanical inspection. I kept glancing over at it during my shift, expecting to see Jimmy there adjusting his settings and checking his materials like he always did. On Wednesday night, around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something over the noise of my own machine. I shut off the press and listened. From the direction of Jimmy's station, I could hear the distinct sound of his hydraulic press running. I walked over to investigate. The machine was locked out with multiple padlocks and warning tags. The electrical breaker was physically removed. There was no way for it to be running, but I could still hear it. The rhythmic his thump of the hydraulic cycle, exactly the sound Jimmy's press had made when it was operating. I put my ear close to the machine, and the sound was definitely coming from inside. Even though nothing was moving, I reported it to the night supervisor, Bob Henley, who came over to listen for himself. He couldn't hear anything. "Machine's been dead since the accident," he said. "Maybe you're hearing an echo from one of the other presses." But I knew the sound of Jimmy's machine. I'd worked next to it for almost a year. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same sound. This time, I brought Tony Greco, who operated the machine on the other side of Jimmy's station. Tony listened carefully and shook his head. "I don't hear nothing, man. You sure you're feeling okay?" I was starting to think I might be losing my mind until Friday night. I was working late, trying to catch up on a production quota, when I heard the press again. But this time, there was something else. Whistling. Jimmy always whistled while he worked. The same 3 songs over and over. Blue Moon, Fly Me to the Moon, and Moon River. He said it helped him keep time with the machine's rhythm. I could hear all 3 songs faintly, mixed in with the sound of the press. I walked over to Jimmy's station and stood there listening. The sounds were definitely coming from the machine itself, even though it was completely shut down. As I stood there, the whistling stopped, and I heard something that made my blood freeze. Jimmy's voice, muffled but unmistakable. "Hey, buddy, can you give me a hand with this?" The safety guard's acting up again. It was exactly what he'd said to me dozens of times when he was having trouble with his equipment. Jimmy was always asking for help, always willing to return the favor. It was just who he was. Without thinking, I responded. "Sure, Jimmy, what do you need?" The sound of the press stopped immediately. The sudden silence was so complete, it felt like going deaf. Then I heard Jimmy again, clearer this time. "I can't shut it off. The controls aren't working." "Can you hit the emergency stop?" I looked at the machine. It wasn't running, couldn't be running, but Jimmy was asking for help. And Jimmy had never asked me for anything he didn't really need. I reached toward the emergency stop button, then hesitated. The machine was locked out, tagged out, and physically disconnected. There was no power going to it. But I could hear the hydraulic press cycling, and I could hear Jimmy asking for help. "Please," Jimmy's voice said, more urgent now. "It's got me. I can't get loose." I pressed the emergency stop button. Nothing happened, of course. The machine was already off. But the sound of the press stopped, and I heard Jimmy say, "Thanks, buddy. I owe you one." Then silence. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, waiting to see if anything else would happen. Nothing did. But as I turned to walk back to my own machine, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. On the floor next to Jimmy's press was a bologna sandwich, still wrapped in plastic with a bite taken out of it. I didn't tell anyone about that incident. Who would believe me? But it wasn't the last time I heard from Jimmy. Over the next few weeks, it became a regular occurrence. Always around 3 a.m. Always the same sequence. The sound of the press running, Jimmy's whistling, then his voice asking for help with some minor problem. And always, when I pressed the emergency stop button on the dead machine, he would thank me and everything would go quiet. Other workers started noticing things too. Tony mentioned that he sometimes smelled bologna sandwiches near Jimmy's station, even though no one was eating. Bob, the supervisor, found tools arranged in Jimmy's old pattern on the workbench next to the press, even though the area had been cleared out weeks ago. But the strangest part was that production numbers for the entire night shift started improving. We were hitting quotas that had been impossible before Jimmy died, finishing jobs ahead of schedule, having fewer equipment problems. It was like Jimmy was still there, still helping out, still doing his part to keep things running smoothly. I started to think that maybe Jimmy's ghost was a good thing. He'd loved his job, loved the people he worked with, and maybe death hadn't changed that. Maybe he was just looking out for us, the way he always had when he was alive. Then Marcus Webb got hired. Marcus was Jimmy's replacement, a younger guy from another plant who had experience with hydraulic presses. He was competent enough, but he had a completely different attitude than Jimmy. Where Jimmy had been safety conscious and methodical, Marcus was impatient and prone to cutting corners. Marcus started working Jimmy's old machine in late April. The first few nights, everything seemed normal. Marcus did his job, met his quotas, didn't report any problems. But on his fourth night, around 3 a.m., I heard Jimmy's voice again. Only this time he wasn't asking for help. He was giving a warning. "Check your settings," Jimmy's voice called out, loud enough for me to hear over my own machine. "Your pressure's too high. You're going to hurt somebody." I looked over at Marcus. He was working normally, didn't seem to hear anything unusual. A few minutes later, I heard Jimmy again. "Slow down. You're pushing too hard. The metal's not seating properly." Marcus continued working, oblivious to the warnings. Then I heard something that chilled me. "Get away from there. Something's wrong with the safety guard." I shut off my machine and yelled over to Marcus. "Hey, check your safety equipment." "Something might be wrong." Marcus looked annoyed. "Everything's fine. Mind your own business." But I could hear Jimmy's voice getting more urgent. "The guard's going to fail. Step back. Step back now." Without thinking, I ran over to Marcus's station and grabbed him by the shoulder, pulling him away from the press just as the safety guard collapsed and the machine jammed. If Marcus had been standing where he was supposed to be, his arm would have been caught in the mechanism just like Jimmy's had been. Marcus stared at the mangled safety equipment, his face pale. "How did you know that was going to happen?" I couldn't tell him the truth. Instead, I said I'd noticed the guard looked unstable and thought he should check it. After that incident, Marcus started paying more attention to safety protocols. He began checking his equipment more carefully, following procedures Jimmy had established, even asking other workers for advice when something didn't seem right. And gradually, I stopped hearing Jimmy's voice during the night shift. It took me a while to understand what had happened. Jimmy hadn't come back to haunt the factory or to continue working his old job. He'd come back to prevent someone else from dying the way he had. Once Marcus started working safely, once the danger had passed, Jimmy was able to rest. I still work at Riverside Manufacturing, but I've moved to the day shift now. Sometimes when I'm training new employees on the hydraulic presses, I tell them about the importance of safety procedures, about checking equipment twice, about never taking shortcuts, even when you're behind on production. I tell them about Jimmy Torino, who loved his job enough to come back from the dead to keep his replacement safe. And sometimes, late at night when the factory is quiet, I think I can still hear the faint sound of whistling from the floor where Jimmy used to work. Not sad or haunting, but content, like someone who knows his work is finally done. Asterisk. Working as a parking garage attendant sounds like the easiest night job in the world. Cars come in, cars go out, you collect the money and make sure no one steals anything. Most of the time, it really was that simple. The Meridian Plaza parking garage in downtown Seattle was 12 floors of concrete and fluorescent lights, connected to 3 office buildings and a luxury hotel. During the day, it was packed with commuters and business travelers. But after 9 p.m., it became mostly empty except for the overnight hotel guests and the occasional late worker. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And for the first few months, I spent most of my time reading paperback novels and listening to talk radio. The booth where I worked was on the ground level near the entrance, with security monitors showing every floor of the garage. The first time I noticed something unusual, I thought it was just a glitch in the camera system. It was around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. I was half asleep, listening to a conspiracy theory show on the radio, when movement on one of the monitors caught my attention. On the 7th floor camera, I could see a car driving slowly through the parking spaces, its headlights sweeping back and forth like someone was looking for a spot. That wasn't unusual by itself, except for 2 things. First, the 7th floor had been completely empty when I'd checked the monitors 15 minutes earlier. Second, the car appeared to be a 1970 sedan, Maybe a Buick or an Oldsmobile, which seemed out of place in a garage mostly filled with modern vehicles. I watched the monitor as the car continued its slow circuit of the 7th floor. It would drive up one aisle, turn around, come back down another aisle, then repeat the process. After about 5 minutes, the car stopped near the elevator bank, and the headlights went out. I switched to the camera that showed the elevator area, expecting to see someone get out of the car and head to the elevator. But the camera showed an empty parking space. No car, no person, nothing. I flipped back to the wide-angle camera that covered most of the 7th floor. Empty. Every space vacant, just as it had been before. I figured it had to be some kind of technical problem with the monitors. Maybe old footage getting mixed in with the live feed. The security system was pretty outdated, and we'd had glitches before. But 3 nights later, it happened again. Same floor, same car, same slow search for a parking spot that ended with the vehicle disappearing from the cameras. This time, I decided to check it out in person. I took the elevator up to the 7th floor and walked around the entire level. Empty. No cars. No signs that anyone had been there recently. The concrete was dusty, and I didn't see any tire tracks that would indicate recent activity. But as I was walking back toward the elevator, I noticed something strange. In the parking space where I'd seen the car stop on the monitor, the concrete was clean. Not just clean, but wet, like someone had recently washed it. The smell in the air was sharp and chemical, like industrial cleaner mixed with something metallic. Back in the booth, I made a note in the logbook about the camera malfunction and decided to keep a closer eye on the monitors. Over the next week, I saw the phantom car 4 more times. Always the same pattern. 7th floor, slow driving, parking by the elevators, then disappearing. And each time I went to investigate, I found the same wet spot on the concrete and the same chemical smell. I started asking other employees if they'd noticed anything unusual about the 7th floor. The day shift attendant, Miguel, hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. But Carmen, who worked the evening shift until I arrived, mentioned that she'd had a few complaints from hotel guests about car alarms going off in the middle of the night. Always on the 7th floor, she said. But when security goes to check, there's never any alarm actually sounding. Guests say they hear it through their windows, but the monitors don't pick up anything. I decided to research the garage's history, see if there had been any accidents or incidents that might explain what I was experiencing. What I found in the local newspaper archives made my stomach turn. 3 years earlier, a man named Robert Chun had been found dead in his car on the 7th floor of the Meridian Plaza parking garage. He'd been missing for 4 days before someone noticed the smell and called security. Robert had been a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, divorced, living alone in a downtown condo. According to the police report, he'd shot himself in his car after losing his job, facing bankruptcy. The car had been a 1974 Buick LeSabre, green with a white roof. But here's where it got disturbing. Robert hadn't died immediately. The police estimated he'd been alive for several hours after shooting himself, bleeding slowly while the car alarm went off intermittently due to the gunshot damage. His body wasn't found until the car's battery finally died and the alarm stopped sounding. The article mentioned that hotel guests had complained about a car alarm going off for 3 straight nights before the body was discovered. But security had been unable to locate the source of the sound. I realized I'd been watching Robert Chun's final hours play out over and over again on the security monitors. His desperate search for a parking spot where he wouldn't be immediately discovered, his final moments in the car, and the alarm that had sounded while he slowly bled to death. Armed with this information, I decided to try a different approach. The next time I saw the phantom car, 2 nights later, at 2:17 a.m., the Buick appeared on the 7th floor cameras. Instead of going up to investigate after it disappeared, I waited and watched the monitor carefully dot at 2:43 a.m. The car reappeared in the same spot where it had vanished. This time, I could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel. The car. Alarms started going off, the hazard lights blinking in a frantic pattern. I grabbed my radio and, instead of calling security, I spoke directly to the monitor. "Robert, my name is Dave. I work here. I know what happened to you, and I'm sorry. But you don't have to keep going through this." The car alarm stopped immediately. The figure in the driver's seat straightened up and seemed to look directly at the camera. "You've been looking for help for 3 years," I continued. "The people who should have found you, who should have helped you, they failed. But you're not alone now. I see you." The hazard lights stopped blinking. For a moment, everything was still. Then the figure raised one hand, pressed it against the driver's side window, and held it there for maybe 10 seconds. When he lowered his hand, the car slowly drove toward the exit ramp and disappeared from the camera. I never saw the phantom Buick again. The hotel guests stopped complaining about car alarms, and the 7th floor went back to being just another empty parking level. But sometimes, when I'm doing my rounds late at night, I find small things that weren't there before. A quarter on the ground near the elevator. A coffee cup that's still warm sitting on the concrete barrier. Once, I found a business card for a suicide prevention hotline, carefully placed where someone walking by couldn't miss it. I think Robert is still around, but he's not trapped in his final moments anymore. He's trying to help other people who might be going through what he went through. People who might be looking for a quiet place to end their pain. The night shift teaches you that not all ghosts are there to scare you. Sometimes they're just trying to make sure no one else has to die alone. *WXRT was a small FM station that broadcast from a converted house on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. We played classic rock during the day and switched to alternative and underground music after midnight. I worked the overnight shift, 12 a.m. to 6 a.m., which meant I was essentially alone in the building for 6 hours with nothing but my voice, a board full of switches, and a stack of vinyl records. The station had been around since the 1970s, and the equipment showed its age. Half the lights in the building didn't work, the heating system made strange noises, and the microphone in the main booth had a tendency to pick up interference from passing cars and occasionally CB radio chatter from truckers on the nearby highway. I'd been working the overnight slot for about 4 months when I first heard the voice that wasn't supposed to be there. It was a Thursday night in December, around 3 a.m., during one of those dead quiet stretches when you start to wonder if anyone is actually listening. I was playing a long instrumental track by Pink Floyd and taking the opportunity to organize my playlist for the rest of the show. As "Shine on You Crazy Diamond" faded out, I opened my microphone and started to introduce the next song. But before I could speak, another voice came through the speakers. It was male, older, with the smooth, professional delivery of someone who'd been in radio for decades. And he said, very clearly, "This is WXRT, Portland's voice in the darkness, and you're listening to The Mike Sullivan Show." The problem was, I was the only person in the building, and my name isn't Mike Sullivan. I looked around the booth, checking to make sure I hadn't accidentally triggered a recording or picked up a signal from another station. All the equipment showed normal readings. The voice had definitely come through our broadcast system. Asterisk. I quickly introduced the next song and put on a long track to give myself time to think. There was no Mike Sullivan working at WXRT, at least not during my time there. I made a mental note to ask the station manager about it in the morning. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same voice, same introduction. This time I was ready for it. I had my hand on the microphone switch and managed to cut off the mysterious announcement before it finished. But as I started to speak, I heard something that made my blood run cold. In the background, behind my own voice, I could hear faint music playing. Not the song I had queued up, but something older, maybe from the 1960s, with a scratchy quality like it was being played on an old turntable. I spent my entire shift that night trying to track down the source of the interference. I checked every piece of equipment, every cable, every connection. Nothing seemed out of place. On Friday, I arrived at work early and talked to Jerry, the station manager, about what I'd been experiencing. "Mike Sullivan," Jerry said, scratching his beard. "Yeah, I remember Mike. He worked here back in the early 80s. Did the overnight shift, same as you. Guy was a legend around here. Had this incredible voice and knew more about music than anyone I've ever met. What happened to him?" I asked. Jerry's expression darkened. Heart attack. Right here in the booth, middle of his show. It was a Saturday night in February 1983. He was introducing a song, opened his microphone, and just collapsed, dead before the paramedics arrived. I felt my stomach drop. What time did it happen? Around 3 a.m., I think. The next song played out, then there was dead air for about 4 hours until the morning guys showed up and found him. I didn't tell Jerry about the voice I'd been hearing. Instead, I asked if anyone else had reported strange experiences during the overnight shift. "Funny you should ask," Jerry said. "We've had 3 different overnight DJs quit in the last 5 years. They all mentioned weird technical problems, equipment acting up, that sort of thing. I figured it was just the old building and older equipment. That night, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of fighting the mysterious voice, I would wait for it and see what happened. At 2:58 a.m., I queued up "Shine on You Crazy Diamond" again, the same song that had been playing when I first heard the voice. As it faded out, I opened my microphone but didn't speak. Right on schedule, Mike Sullivan's voice came through the speakers. "This is WXRT, Portland's voice in the darkness, and you're listening to The Mike Sullivan Show." This time, instead of cutting him off, I waited. Mike continued, "It's a cold February night here in Portland, and I've got some special requests from our late-night listeners. This one goes out to Sarah in Beaverton, who's working the night shift at the hospital and needs something to keep her company." Then he played a song I'd never heard before, something bluesy and melancholic with a male vocalist singing about loneliness and long nights. I sat there listening, fascinated despite my fear. Mike's voice had a warmth to it that made you feel like he was talking directly to you, like he understood what it was like to be awake in the small hours when the rest of the world was sleeping. After the song ended, Mike came back on. That was Night Shift Blues by Johnny Hartman, a deep cut for the insomniacs and the night workers. If you're out there listening, you're not alone. The night shift has its own community, its own rhythm, its own beauty. He played 3 more songs, each one perfectly chosen for the mood and the moment. Between tracks, he shared stories about the music, about the artists, about the experience of being awake when everyone else was asleep. At 3:47 a.m., Mike's voice returned one last time. "This is Mike Sullivan, signing off for the night. Thanks for keeping me company out there in the darkness. Remember, the sun always comes up, and there's always another song to play." Then silence. The normal hum of the equipment returned, and I realized I was back in control of the broadcast. I looked at the clock. Almost an hour had passed, but it had felt like minutes. And during that entire time, I hadn't felt scared or confused. I'd felt comforted, like I was listening to a master at work, someone who understood the art of late-night radio in a way I was still learning. Over the next few weeks, Mike's visits became regular. Not every night, but 3 or 4 times a week, always starting around 3 a.m., always lasting about an hour. He would play music I'd never heard, share stories about the station's history, and talk to the listeners like they were old friends. I started to look forward to these sessions. Mike was teaching me things about radio that I'd never learned in school, showing me how to read the mood of the night, how to choose music that would speak to people who were alone with their thoughts. But I also started noticing changes in myself. I was staying up later on my nights off, feeling more energetic during the overnight hours and more tired during the day. My voice was starting to sound different, more like Mike's smooth delivery and less like my own uncertain style. One night, after Mike had finished his usual segment, I decided to try talking to him directly. As his voice faded out, I opened my microphone and said, "Mike, I know you can hear me. I wanted to thank you for everything you've been teaching me." For a moment, there was only static. Then Mike's voice came back, clearer than ever. "Dave, you've got a good ear and a good heart. The night shift needs people like you. But you need to be careful not to lose yourself in the darkness. The night can be addictive, and some of us never find our way back to the daylight. What happened to you, Mike? I love this job too much. Lived for the overnight hours, for the connection with people who couldn't sleep. I stopped going out during the day, stopped seeing friends, stopped having a life outside this booth. The night shift became my whole world, and when my heart gave out, I couldn't bear to leave. I felt a chill of recognition. I'd been following the same pattern, isolating myself, living only for the hours when I was on the air. How do I avoid that? I asked. Remember that this is just a job, not a life. The people listening need you to be human, not just a voice in the darkness. Take care of yourself during the day. Stay connected to the world outside this booth. Mike's visits became less frequent after that conversation. When he did appear, it was usually just to play one particularly perfect song or to share a brief piece of advice about broadcasting. The last time I heard from him was on a February night, almost exactly a year after our first encounter. He played "The Long and Winding Road" by the Beatles, and when it ended, he said simply, "Thanks for keeping the music alive, Dave. The night shift is in good hands." I stayed at WXRT for another 2 years, but I took Mike's advice to heart. I made sure to have a life outside the station, to stay connected with friends, to spend time in the daylight world. When I finally moved to a day shift position at a larger station, I left a note for whoever would take over the overnight slot. I told them about Mike Sullivan, about his love for the music and the listeners, and about the importance of not losing yourself in the beautiful loneliness of the night shift. I still work in radio, but now I do the morning drive show at a station in Seattle. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I tune into WXRT on the internet. The overnight DJ sounds good, professional, engaged. And once in a while, I think I can hear something familiar in the background, the faint sound of an old turntable, and a voice that understood what it meant to be a companion to people in the darkness. The night shift has its own magic, but Mike Sullivan taught me that the real trick is knowing when to step back into the light. Asterisk. The Ambassador Hotel in downtown Sacramento was the kind of place that had seen better days. Built in the 1960s, it was trying to maintain a facade of respectability while slowly succumbing to the wear and tear of decades of budget travelers, long-term residents, and the occasional business conference that couldn't afford the newer hotels across town. I worked as the night auditor, which meant I handled the front desk from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., processed the daily financial reports, and dealt with whatever problems arose during the overnight hours. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid better than most entry-level jobs, and I could usually get some studying done during the quiet periods. The hotel had 127 rooms across 8 floors, and during the week, we averaged about 60% occupancy. Weekends were busier, especially when there were events in town, but Sunday through Wednesday nights were generally peaceful. Asterisk room 412 was different. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The room was on the 4th floor, in the middle of the hallway, identical to every other room in the hotel. Same furniture, same carpet, same beige walls and generic artwork. But room 412 had a problem. Guests didn't sleep well there. It started with complaints about noise. People would call the front desk in the middle of the night, saying they could hear someone walking around in the room above them. The problem was, room 412 was directly below room 512, and room 512 was almost always vacant. I'd go up to the 5th floor to check, using my master key to open 512 and look around. Empty, quiet, no signs that anyone had been there. I'd apologize to the guest in 412, maybe offer to move them to another room if we had availability, and make a note in the system about a possible noise complaint. But it kept happening. Different guests, same complaint. Always the sound of footsteps in the room above. Always during the late night or early morning hours. Always when room 512 was unoccupied. After about a month of these complaints, I decided to investigate more systematically. I started keeping detailed records of when the noise complaints occurred and what was happening in both rooms at the time. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. The complaints always happened between 2 and 4 a.m. They always came from guests staying alone in room 412, and they always described the same thing, the sound of someone pacing back and forth, sometimes for hours at a time. But here's what made it really strange. The guests who complained weren't light sleepers or easily bothered people. They were usually business travelers, people accustomed to staying in hotels and dealing with typical hotel noise. And they all described the sound the same way. Not like someone walking normally, but like someone who was agitated, distressed, unable to rest. I brought the issue to Janet, the hotel manager, and she told me something that made my skin crawl. Room 412 has been a problem for years, she said. We've had the maintenance team check the floors, the walls, the plumbing, everything. There's nothing structurally wrong with the room or the one above it, but guests keep complaining about the noise. Have you ever stayed in the room yourself? I asked. Janet nodded slowly. Once, about 3 years ago, when we were fully booked and I needed to test whether the complaints were legitimate. I lasted until about 3 a.m. before I had to leave. The sound of footsteps was so loud and persistent that I couldn't sleep. But when I went upstairs to investigate, room 512 was empty and locked. What do you think is causing it? I think room 412 has a history that we don't talk about in the marketing brochures. Janet pulled out a file folder from her desk drawer and handed it to me. Inside were police reports, newspaper clippings, and incident reports dating back to 1987. The story they told was tragic. In March of 1987, a man named David Martinez had been staying in room 412 for 3 weeks. He was going through a difficult divorce and had been living at the hotel while looking for an apartment. According to the police report, David had been struggling with depression and had been drinking heavily during his stay. On March 15th, hotel staff found David dead in room 412. He had hanged himself from the bathroom door, and the coroner estimated he had been dead for about 6 hours before he was discovered. But here's the disturbing part. For the 3 weeks leading up to his death, other guests had complained about noise coming from room 412. People in adjacent rooms and on the floors above and below reported the sound of someone pacing relentlessly, sometimes all night long. The front desk log showed dozens of complaints about the noise, describing the exact same pattern of distressed pacing that current guests still reported. David Martinez had been unable to sleep, walking back and forth in his room for hours every night, probably struggling with the depression and anxiety that eventually killed him. And apparently, he'd never stopped. Why don't we just take the room out of service? I asked Janet. We tried that for about 6 months after the suicide. But the complaints didn't stop. Guests in room 312, directly below, started reporting the same footsteps coming from above them. It was like taking 412 out of service just made the problem worse. Janet closed the folder. The strange thing is, some guests don't hear anything at all. Couples, families, people traveling together seem to sleep fine in 412. It's only The single occupants, the people staying alone, who report the noise. That night, I decided to test something. We had a guest checking into 412, a businessman traveling alone. Instead of waiting for him to complain, I proactively called his room at 2:30 a.m. "I'm sorry to disturb you," I said when he answered. "We've had reports of a noise issue on your floor. Are you hearing anything unusual?" "Actually, yeah," he said, sounding relieved that someone had asked. "There's someone pacing around upstairs. Back and forth, back and forth. It's been going on for about an hour." I was just about to call the front desk. "I'll send someone up to check on it right away," I assured him. I went up to the 5th floor and opened room 512 with my master key. Empty, as always. But as I stood in the quiet room, I could hear something faint coming from below, the sound of someone walking back and forth in room 412. Went down one floor and listened at the door of 412. I could hear the guest moving around inside, but it wasn't the restless pacing I'd expected. It sounded like someone getting ready for bed. Normal footsteps with normal pauses. The sound of distressed pacing was coming from somewhere else. Somewhere between the floors, maybe, or from some space that didn't correspond to any actual room. I went back to the front desk and thought about what Janet had said about couples and families not hearing the noise. Maybe David Martinez's spirit was reaching out to people who were alone, people who might understand the isolation and depression that had consumed him during his final weeks. The next morning, I researched David Martinez's background. He had been an accountant, recently separated from his wife, struggling to rebuild his life after a 20-year marriage ended. According to the newspaper obituary, he'd been described by friends as a quiet, gentle man who had been devastated by the divorce and had been having trouble adjusting to living alone. That night, when the inevitable complaint came from room 412, I tried a different approach. Instead of going upstairs to check the empty room above, I knocked softly on the door of 412. "Is everything okay?" I asked the guest, a middle-aged woman traveling on business. "I can't sleep," she said through the door. "Someone upstairs is pacing back and forth. They sound distressed, like they're really upset about something." "Ma'am, this might sound unusual, but I think the person making the noise might be someone who needs help, someone who's going through a difficult time. Sometimes talking to them, letting them know they're not alone, can help." I heard her walk away from the door, then return a moment later. "You're right," she said softly. "I just tried talking to them through the ceiling, told them that whatever they're going through will get better, that they don't have to face it alone." The pacing stopped. The next morning, the woman checked out early. She told me she'd had the strangest experience, that she'd felt compelled to offer comfort to someone she couldn't see, and that afterward she'd slept peacefully for the rest of the night. I started sharing this approach with other guests who complained about the noise in room 412. Most of them thought I was crazy, but a few were willing to try talking to the restless spirit above them. And in every case, when someone offered David Martinez words of comfort and companionship, the pacing stopped. I worked at the Ambassador Hotel for 2 more years. Room 412 continued to be a problem for some guests, but I noticed that the complaints became less frequent and less intense. It was as if David was slowly finding some peace, one compassionate conversation at a time. The night shift taught me that some hauntings aren't about fear or malevolence. Sometimes they're just about loneliness, about people who died alone and are still looking for someone to acknowledge their pain and offer them a moment of human connection. Room 412 is still in service at the Ambassador Hotel, and occasionally there are still noise complaints. But now the front desk staff knows what to do. Instead of checking the empty room above, they gently suggest that the guest try talking to whoever is making the noise, offering a few words of comfort to someone who might be having the worst night of their eternal life, because sometimes that's all a restless spirit needs, to find a little peace. Midwest Distribution Center was a massive warehouse facility that supplied retail stores across 3 states. The building was the size of several football fields, with rows of 30-foot-tall shelving units stretching as far as you could see in any direction. During the day, the place buzzed with activity. Forklifts moving pallets, workers picking orders, trucks loading and unloading at the dozens of dock doors. At night, it was a different world. I worked the overnight shift as an inventory specialist, which meant I walked the warehouse with a handheld scanner, checking stock levels and looking for discrepancies in the computer system. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and for most of those 8 hours, I was alone in a building that covered over 400,000 square feet. The warehouse was divided into sections based on product categories: electronics, clothing, home goods, automotive, parts. Each section had its own rows of towering shelves, connected by a network of aisles wide enough for forklifts to navigate. The lighting was motion activated to save energy, so as I walked through the facility, pools of fluorescent light would flicker on ahead of me while the areas I'd already passed faded back into darkness. For the first few months, the job was exactly what I expected: repetitive, solitary, and peaceful. I'd listen to podcasts through my earphones while scanning barcodes and updating inventory records. The biggest challenge was staying alert during the slow hours between 2 and 5 a.m. when the combination of physical activity and mental boredom could make you feel like you were sleepwalking. That changed in October when I started hearing the forklift. The first time it happened, I assumed someone else was in the building. It was around 3 a.m., and I was working in the electronics section when I heard the distinct beep-beep of a forklift backing up somewhere in the distance. The sound echoed off the concrete walls and metal shelving, making it hard to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. I took off my earphones and listened carefully. The beeping stopped, but I could hear the mechanical whir of a forklift's hydraulic system raising or lowering a pallet. Then the sound of movement, the electric motor humming as the machine drove to another location. I walked toward the sound, expecting to find another employee working a special project, or maybe a maintenance crew doing some late-night repairs. But as I moved through the aisles, the forklift sound seemed to stay ahead of me, always in the next section over, always just out of sight. After 20 minutes of searching, I gave up and called the night supervisor on my radio. "Hey Tom, is anyone else in the building tonight? I'm hearing forklift activity in the west section." "Negative," Tom's voice crackled back. "You're the only one scheduled. All the forklifts are plugged into the charging stations in the maintenance." "Hey, want me to come take a look?" "Yeah, that'd be good." Tom arrived 15 minutes later, and we spent another half hour walking through the warehouse, checking every aisle and section. All the forklifts were exactly where they should be, plugged into their charging stations with their batteries topped off. None of them showed any signs of recent use. "Must have been sound carrying from outside," Tom concluded. "Sometimes the loading dock activity from the trucking companies next door can echo weird in here." But I knew the difference between outside traffic and the specific sounds of a forklift operating inside the warehouse. And the sounds had definitely been coming from inside the building. 3 nights later, it happened again. Same time, same pattern. The backing alarm, the hydraulic whir, the electric motor moving through the aisles. This time, I didn't bother looking for the source. I just continued my work and tried to ignore it. But ignoring it became impossible. When I realized the phantom forklift was following me, I was working through the home goods section, scanning items on a particular shelf, when I heard the backing alarm start up behind me. I kept working, not turning around, but the sound got closer. Then I heard the hydraulics engage, as if the forklift was lifting something heavy right behind me. When I finally turned around, the aisle was empty. But the concrete floor showed fresh tire marks, black rubber streaks that hadn't been there when I'd walked down the aisle 10 minutes earlier. I followed the tire marks to see where they led. They went down one aisle, turned left, continued for about 100 feet, then simply stopped. No forklift, no explanation for how the marks had gotten there. That's when I decided to research the warehouse's history, what I found in the local newspaper archives explained everything. 2 years before I started working at Midwest Distribution, there had been a fatal accident in the warehouse. An employee named Robert Kowalski, a forklift operator with 15 years of experience, had been working alone during the overnight shift when something went wrong. According to the OSHA investigation report, Robert had been moving a pallet of automotive parts when the load shifted and fell, pinning him underneath. The weight of the falling merchandise had crushed his chest, and he died almost instantly. But here's the disturbing part. Robert hadn't been discovered until the day shift arrived 8 hours later. He'd been working alone, with no supervisor or other employees in the building, and the accident had happened around 3 a.m. For 8 hours, Robert Kowalski had lain dead under a pile of automotive parts while the warehouse sat silent and empty. Around him, the article mentioned that Robert had been known for his dedication to the job, often working overtime and coming in early to make sure shipments were processed on schedule. His co-workers described him as someone who took pride in his work and never left a job. Half-finished. Now I understood what I was hearing. Robert was still there, still working his overnight shift, still moving pallets and fulfilling orders even though he'd been dead for 2 years. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to the pattern of the forklift sounds. They always occurred in the same sections of the warehouse where Robert would have been working: automotive parts, heavy machinery, industrial supplies. The sounds followed a logical sequence, as if someone was systematically working through a list of orders, picking up pallets from storage locations and moving them to staging areas. I started leaving small signs of my presence in the areas where I heard the forklift activity. A coffee cup on a shelf, a clipboard left in a specific position, my jacket draped over a pallet. And invariably, these items would be moved or rearranged by the next night, always in ways that suggested someone was trying to keep the workspace organized and efficient. One night, I decided to try communicating directly with Robert's spirit. I was in the automotive section when the forklift sound started up behind me. Instead of ignoring them or walking away, I stood still and spoke to the empty air. "Robert, if that's you, I want you to know that I respect the work you're doing. You were a good employee and you cared about this place, but you don't have to keep working. Your shift is over." The forklift sound stopped immediately. For a moment, the warehouse was completely silent. Then I heard something that made my hair stand on end: the sound of a forklift's parking brake being engaged, followed by the beep of the machine shutting down. I never heard the phantom forklift again. During my remaining time at Midwest Distribution, the tire marks stopped appearing, and the mysterious rearrangement of items in the automotive section came to an end. But I did find something that confirmed my belief that Robert had finally found peace. In the maintenance bay where the forklifts were stored, someone had left a note tucked under the windshield wiper of forklift number 7. The machine Robert had been operating when he died. The note was written in pencil on a piece of scratch paper, and it said simply, "Shift complete. Going home now." I kept that note, and when I eventually left the warehouse job to pursue other opportunities, I left it in the employee break room with a brief explanation of who Robert Kowalski was and how much he had cared about his work. Night shift teaches you that some people love their jobs so much that not even death can make them quit. But sometimes, all they need is someone to acknowledge their dedication and give them permission to rest. Robert Kowalski was a good employee who deserved to have his final shift end with dignity. And now, whenever I hear the sound of a forklift in the distance, I think about the people who work through the night to keep the world running. And I hope they all get to go home when their shift is over. * working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of Bakersfield, California, was supposed to be simple. Cars come and go. People buy snacks and energy drinks. You restock the cigarettes and clean the bathrooms. Most nights, it really was that straightforward. The Speedway station where I worked was positioned at a lonely intersection where Highway 99 met a smaller county road. During the day, we got steady traffic from commuters and truckers. But after midnight, customers became sparse, sometimes going hours between visitors. I'd been working there for about 6 months when I first encountered what I came to think of as the traveling man. It was around 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in November when I saw headlights pull up to pump 3. Nothing unusual about that, except when I looked up from the magazine I was reading. I couldn't see a car at the pump. I walked to the window and peered out. The pump was running, the digital display showing gallons and dollars climbing steadily. But there was no vehicle attached to the nozzle. The gas was flowing out onto the concrete, creating a puddle that reflected the overhead lights. I ran outside and hit the emergency stop button, shutting off all the pumps. The flow stopped immediately, leaving maybe 10 gallons of gasoline spreading across the pavement. I looked around for whoever had been operating the pump, but the lot was empty. I spent the next hour cleaning up the spill and filing an incident report. The pump showed no mechanical problems when I tested it afterward, and the security camera only showed me running outside and stopping the flow. There was no footage of anyone operating the pump or of any vehicle at the station during that time. My manager, Steve, reviewed the incident the next day and concluded it had to be some kind of equipment malfunction, maybe a problem with the automatic shutoff mechanism. He had a repair technician come out to inspect pump 3, but they couldn't find anything wrong. 3 weeks later, it happened again. Same pump, same time of night, same invisible customer filling up a car that wasn't there. This time, I was ready for it. As soon as I saw the pump start running, I grabbed the station security camera remote and manually focused one of the cameras on pump 3. What I saw on the monitor made my blood run cold. There was a man standing at the pump, maybe 40 years old, wearing a blue flannel shirt and jeans. He was methodically filling up what appeared to be a 1980s pickup truck, dark-colored with chrome bumpers. But on the camera, I could only see the man and the truck in black and white, like I was watching old footage mixed in with the live feed. I stepped outside, and the pump area looked empty to my eyes, even though I could still hear the sound of gasoline flowing and see the numbers climbing on the digital display. Back inside, the monitor showed the man hanging up the nozzle and walking toward the station entrance. A moment later, my door chime sounded and I heard footsteps on the tile floor. "Evening," said a male voice. "I need to pay for the gas on pump 3. I looked around the store. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear him moving around, the soft squeak of his boots on the floor. "That'll be $37.50, I said, not knowing what else to do. I heard the sound of paper bills being placed on the counter, but when I looked down, there was nothing there. "Keep the change," the voice said. "Long drive ahead." The door chime sounded again, and the footsteps faded away. When I checked the register at the end of my shift, I was $37.50 over in cash, with no explanation for where the money had come from. I started researching the history of the intersection, looking for any accidents or incidents that might explain what I was experiencing. What I found in the local newspaper archives was a story from 1993 about a fatal car accident at the exact spot where the gas station now stood. A man named Carl Hendricks had been driving home from his construction job late one night when his pickup truck ran out of gas on the county road. He'd walked to the nearest gas station, which was about 3 miles away, bought a gas can, and filled it up. On his way back to his truck, Carl had been struck by a drunk driver who ran a red light at the intersection. He was killed instantly, still carrying the gas can he'd bought to fill up his truck. The article mentioned that Carl's truck was found the next morning, sitting on the shoulder of the county road with its gas gauge reading empty. Carl Hendricks had died trying to get gas for his truck, and apparently, he was still trying to complete that final fill-up. Over the next few months, Carl became a regular customer. Always the same time, always pump 3, always $37.50. I got used to the routine, learned to expect him every few weeks. But Carl wasn't just getting gas. He was also trying to help other people who found themselves in his situation. I started noticing that when drivers pulled up late at night with cars that were running on empty, their tanks would mysteriously hold more gas than they should. A car with a 12-gallon tank would take 15 gallons. A motorcycle that should have held 4 gallons would take 6. It was like Carl was somehow stretching the fuel, making sure people had enough gas to get where they were going safely. One night, a young woman pulled up in an old Honda that was clearly running on fumes. She looked scared, kept checking her mirrors like someone might be following her. When she tried to pay for her gas, her credit card was declined, and she didn't have enough cash. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to cry. "I just need enough to get to my sister's house. It's only about 20 miles. I was about to offer to cover the difference when I heard Carl's voice. "Tell her to fill it up. It's taken care of." I looked around the store, but I was alone with the customer. "You know what?" I told her. "Don't worry about it. Just fill up your tank." She looked confused but grateful. When she put the nozzle in her tank, I watched the pump run up to $42. But when she came inside to sign the receipt, the register only showed the $8 she'd already paid. As she drove away, I heard Carl say, "She make it now." That's what matters. Carl's visits continued for the 2 years I worked at that gas station. He never caused problems, never frightened anyone, just quietly went about the business of making sure people had enough fuel to get home safely. When I finally left the job to pursue other opportunities, I left a note for my replacement explaining about Carl Hendricks and his regular visits to Pump 3. I told them not to be afraid, that Carl was just a man who died trying to help himself and now spent eternity helping others. I heard from my replacement about 6 months later. He said he'd experienced everything I described, but he'd also discovered something new. When Carl made his purchases, the money he left behind was always old bills, dating from the early 1990s, as if he was still carrying the same cash he'd had in his wallet the night he died. The night shift teaches you that some people's sense of responsibility doesn't end with death. Carl Hendricks was a man who died trying to solve a simple problem, and his spirit couldn't rest until he'd found a way to help others avoid his fate. Every time I pass a gas station late at night, I think about Carl, still making his rounds, still trying to make sure no one else runs out of gas on a dark road. And I hope that wherever he is, he knows his work is appreciated by all the travelers he's helped get home safely. Lincoln Elementary School was built in 1962, and like most schools its age, it had accumulated decades of memories, both good and bad. During the day, it was filled with the sounds of children laughing and learning. But at night, when I cleaned the empty hallways and classrooms, it became something different entirely. I worked the night custodial shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., responsible for cleaning all 32 classrooms, the gymnasium, the cafeteria, and the main office. It was solitary work, but I didn't mind. I'd put on my headphones, listen to music or podcasts, and work my way through the building systematically. The first strange thing I noticed was in Mrs. Peterson's third-grade classroom. Every morning when I finished cleaning it, I'd stack the tiny chairs on top of the desks, the way custodians have done in schools for generations. But 3 or 4 times a week, when I came back the next night, one of the chairs would be on the floor, positioned in front of the chalkboard as if a child had been sitting there. At first, I thought maybe the day shift custodian was moving things around or teachers were coming in early and rearranging their rooms. But when I asked around, nobody knew anything about it. Then I started noticing other small changes. In Mrs. Johnson's kindergarten class, the reading corner would be disturbed, with books scattered on the floor and the beanbag chairs moved around. In Mr. Rodriguez's fourth grade room, words would be written on the chalkboard even though I'd cleaned it spotless the night before. The words were always the same. "Can you help me with my homework?" Written in a child's handwriting, in chalk that should have been erased hours earlier. I mentioned this to Dorothy, the school secretary who'd worked at Lincoln for over 20 years. "Oh," she said, her expression changing. "You're seeing Tommy?" "Tommy?" Dorothy looked around to make sure we were alone, then lowered her voice. "Tommy Patterson. He was a student here back in the late 80s. Sweet little boy, but he struggled in school. Had a hard time with reading. Couldn't keep up with the other kids. His parents were, well, they weren't very patient with him." She paused, organizing papers on her desk with unnecessary care. "Tommy used to stay after school almost every day, trying to get extra help from his teachers. But his parents would get angry when he came home late, so he started hiding in the building, staying as long as he could before going home to face whatever was waiting for him." What happened to him? One night in February of 1989, Tommy was staying late again, trying to finish a math assignment he couldn't figure out. The teacher had to leave for a meeting, and Tommy promised he'd only stay a few more minutes. Dorothy's voice got quieter, but Tommy fell asleep at his desk. The teacher forgot about him. The custodian didn't check that classroom carefully, and everyone assumed he'd gone home. The building was locked up with Tommy still inside. I felt a chill. And the heating system malfunctioned that night. Some kind of problem with the boiler, and the temperature dropped into the teens. They found Tommy the next morning, still sitting at his desk, still trying to work on his math problems. He'd frozen to death. I stared at Dorothy, processing what she'd told me. "And you think he's still here?" "I think Tommy never got the help he needed when he was alive, and now he's still trying to get someone to notice that he's struggling. Still looking for a teacher who won't leave him behind." That night, I approached my custodial duties differently. When I got to Mrs. Peterson's classroom, I wasn't surprised to find the chair positioned in front of the chalkboard. But this time, instead of moving it back, I sat down in another child-sized chair and spoke to the empty room. "Tommy, is that you? Are you having trouble with your schoolwork?" The room was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, letters began appearing on the chalkboard, as if written by an invisible hand. I can't read the big words. They're too hard. I got up and walked to the chalkboard. Someone had written a list of vocabulary words there, probably left over from the day's lesson. Words like responsibility and environment and democracy. I erased the board and wrote simpler words. Cat, dog, sun, run. "Let's start with these," I said. "These are easier. Can you read these words, Tommy?" New writing appeared below my words. "Yes, cat, dog, sun, run. I know those." Over the next few weeks, I started spending part of my shift in that classroom, working with Tommy on basic reading skills. I'd write words on the board, and he'd respond by writing back. Sometimes he'd ask questions about letters or sounds, the kind of questions a struggling 7-year-old might ask. But I also started to understand the depth of Tommy's problems. His questions revealed that he'd been dealing with more than just learning difficulties. "Why do grown-ups get so angry when you can't read fast?" he wrote one night. "Are you stupid if you need extra help? Why did my daddy say I was never going to amount to anything?" Each question broke my heart a little more. Tommy hadn't just died from the cold that night in 1989. He died believing he was stupid, worthless, destined for failure. I started bringing children's books from the public library, simple stories with large print and lots of pictures. I'd read them aloud to the empty classroom, and sometimes I'd see evidence that Tommy was following along. Tiny fingerprints would appear on the pages, or the book would fall open to a particular story the next night. But the real breakthrough came when I brought in a book about a little boy who struggled with reading, but eventually learned with the help of a patient teacher. That night, Tommy's response on the chalkboard was different. "That boy is like me. But he got better at reading." "Yes, he did," I wrote back. "And so can you. You're not stupid, Tommy. You just learn differently than other kids, and that's okay." The writing that appeared next was shaky, as if the invisible hand holding the chalk was trembling. "Really? I'm not stupid, really. You're a smart boy who just needs more time and help. There's nothing wrong with that." After that night, my interactions with Tommy changed. Instead of just struggling with reading, he started asking questions about everything. Math, science, history. It was like he was trying to absorb all the learning he'd missed out on during his short life. And gradually, other teachers and staff started noticing changes in the school. The building felt warmer somehow, more welcoming. Kids who were struggling academically seemed to find extra motivation to keep trying. Teachers reported that their most difficult students were suddenly asking for extra help instead of giving. It was as if Tommy's newfound confidence and love of learning was spreading throughout the school. One night in May, almost 8 months after I'd first started working with Tommy, I found a longer message waiting for me on the chalkboard. "Thank you for helping me learn. I understand now that I'm not stupid. I was just scared and sad. But now I know that it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to learn slowly. I think I'm ready to go to the next grade now." I wrote back, "You've worked very hard, Tommy. You should be proud of yourself. You're a smart, brave boy, and you deserve to move on to bigger and better things." The final message appeared slowly, each letter carefully formed. "Will you tell the other kids that it's okay to ask for help? That being different doesn't mean being dumb?" "I promise," I wrote. After that night, I never saw evidence of Tommy's presence again. The chairs stayed stacked on the desks, the chalkboards remained clean, and the books stayed exactly where I left them, but I kept my promise. When I interacted with students during the day, when teachers asked me about kids who were struggling, I always shared Tommy's message. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to learn differently. And being different doesn't mean being dumb. I worked at Lincoln Elementary for 3 more years, and during that time, I watched the school develop a reputation for being especially supportive of students with learning differences. Teachers became more patient, kids became more willing to ask for help, and the overall atmosphere became more nurturing. I like to think Tommy had something to do with that change. A little boy who died believing he was stupid had somehow become the school's invisible advocate for kids who needed extra support. The night shift taught me that some students never stop trying to learn, even after death. And sometimes, the most important lesson a school can teach is that everyone deserves patience, kindness, and the chance to succeed at their own pace. Tommy Patterson never got to graduate from elementary school, but in the end, he might have taught more kids than any teacher who ever worked there. The Regal Cinema on Maple Street had been showing movies since 1978, and while it wasn't the fanciest theater in town, it had a loyal following of people who appreciated the old school movie-going experience. The lobby still had the original red carpet, the concession stand sold real butter popcorn, and the seats were the wide, comfortable kind you don't find in newer theaters. I worked as the overnight cleaning crew supervisor, which meant I arrived after the last show ended and supervised the team that cleaned all 6 theaters. We stocked the concession stand and prepared the building for the next day's operations. Most nights, the work was routine. We'd start in Theater 1 and work our way through the building, picking up trash, mopping floors, and wiping down surfaces. The biggest challenge was usually dealing with the sticky floors and mysterious stains that moviegoers leave behind. But Theater 4 was different. Theater 4 was the smallest of the 6 screens, seating only about 80 people. It typically showed the art house films, foreign movies, and older classics that didn't draw big crowds. Most nights, it had been almost empty during the evening shows. The first time I noticed something unusual was about 3 weeks into the job. My cleaning crew was working through Theater 4 when Maria, one of my best workers, came to find me in the lobby. "Mr. Davis," she said, looking nervous. "There's someone still in Theater 4, in the back row." I followed her back to the theater. The lights were on for cleaning, and I could see every seat clearly. The theater was empty. "I don't see anyone," I told Maria. "Seat G12, she insisted. "There's someone sitting there. I can see the seat cushion compressed, like someone's weight is on it, and I think I see a shadow." I looked at seat G12. The seat did appear to be slightly depressed, as if someone was sitting in it, but I couldn't see anyone there. "Maybe the seat mechanism is broken," I suggested. "Sometimes the springs get worn out and don't bounce back properly." But Maria shook her head. When I got close to clean that row, I could smell cologne, and I heard breathing. I walked over to seat G12 and examined it closely. The cushion was definitely compressed, and there was a faint scent in the air, something old-fashioned and masculine. I tried sitting in the seat next to it, then getting up to see if the cushion would stay depressed. It bounced back to its normal position immediately. "Let's just clean around that area and finish up," I told Maria, but I made a mental note to check the theater's maintenance records for any problems with the seating in that section. The next night, Maria reported the same thing. Seat G12 appeared to be occupied during our cleaning period. Even though the theater was supposed to be empty. This time, I decided to investigate more systematically. I positioned myself in the theater before my cleaning crew arrived and watched seat G12 carefully. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. But as I stared at the seat, I gradually became aware of a presence. Not visible exactly, but unmistakable. Someone was sitting in that seat, watching the blank screen as if a movie was playing. I cleared my throat softly. "Excuse me, the theater is closed for cleaning now. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." There was no response, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I tried a different approach. "Are you enjoying the movie?" This time, I heard something, a soft sigh, the sound of someone settling more comfortably into their seat. I decided to research the theater's history, looking for any incidents or accidents that might explain the presence I was feeling. What I discovered in the local newspaper archives was both sad and touching. In 1994, a man named Frank Morrison had been a regular customer at the Regal Cinema. According to an article about local movie enthusiasts, Frank was retired, widowed, and had been attending matinee showings almost every day for over 10 years. The article described him as the theater's most dedicated patron, someone who loved movies so much that he'd often stay for multiple showings, especially on days when they were playing classic films from the 1940s and 50s. Frank had his favorite seat, G12 in Theater 4, where he could get the best view of the screen and wouldn't be disturbed by other moviegoers. In December of 1994, Frank Morrison died of a heart attack during the showing of Casablanca. He was found in his usual seat after the movie ended, having passed away peacefully while watching one of his favorite films. The article mentioned that Frank had always said he hoped to die watching a good movie, and that his wish had come true in a way. Now I understood what was happening. Frank Morrison was still coming to the movies, still sitting in his favorite seat, still enjoying the films he loved. But unlike some of the other spirits I'd encountered in my night shift work, Frank didn't seem distressed or trapped. He just seemed content. Over the next few weeks, I started paying more attention to the programming schedule for Theater 4. I noticed that the sense of Frank's presence was strongest on nights after they'd shown older films, especially classics from the golden age of Hollywood. On nights after they'd shown modern action movies or horror films, seat G12 felt empty. Frank Morrison had particular tastes in movies, and apparently death hadn't changed his preferences. I started leaving Frank alone during our cleaning routine. I instructed my crew to clean around seat G12 without disturbing it, and I stopped trying to talk to him or acknowledge his presence directly, but I did start doing something else. I began leaving movie schedules from other theaters around town on the concession stand counter, open to the pages showing classic film festivals and revival screenings. And several times, I found those schedules moved to different positions the next morning, with certain showtimes circled in pencil. The Regal Cinema started participating in more classic film events. The manager, perhaps inspired by the positive response from older moviegoers, began scheduling regular Golden Age matinees and classic movie nights. And on those evenings, Theater 4 would be unusually busy, often selling out even though the other screens might be half-empty. I think Frank's love of movies was contagious. His enthusiasm for the classic films somehow drew other people who shared his passion, creating a community of movie lovers who might not have found each other otherwise. One night I decided to try something different. After we finished cleaning, I dimmed the lights in Theater 4 and started up the projector with a reel of old movie trailers from the 1940s. As the familiar music and vintage graphics filled the screen, I could feel Frank's presence more strongly than ever. The seat cushion in G12 compressed further, and I could swear I heard a contented sigh. After the trailers finished, I left the theater without saying anything. But the next morning, I found a note on my desk, written in old-fashioned handwriting. "Thank you for understanding that some of us just want to keep enjoying the magic of movies." I kept that note, and when I eventually moved on to other opportunities, I left it for my replacement along with an explanation of Frank Morrison's story. The night shift taught me that not all hauntings are about unfinished business or unresolved trauma. Sometimes they're just about love. Frank Morrison loved movies so much that not even death could keep him away from the cinema. And in a world where so many people have forgotten the simple pleasure of losing themselves in a good film, maybe we need spirits like Frank to remind us what we're missing. I still go to the movies regularly, and whenever I'm in a nearly empty theater watching a classic film, I think about Frank Morrison in seat G12, still appreciating the art form he loved. And I hope that wherever he is, he's got a good view of the screen and a comfortable seat. Because some passions are strong enough to transcend death, and the love of movies is definitely one of them. The Metropolitan Transit Authority runs the subway system in our city 24 hours a day, and someone has to operate those trains during the overnight shift when most people are home sleeping. I was that someone for the Red Line, the route that connected downtown to the airport, running through some of the oldest tunnels in the system. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and for most of those 8 hours, I was alone in the operator's cab, guiding a mostly empty train through the underground darkness. The passengers during those hours were a mix of late shift workers, partygoers heading home, and the occasional homeless person looking for a warm place to sleep. The Red Line had 37 stations along its route, and I'd made the round trip so many times I could practically operate the train with my eyes closed. Each station had its own personality. The business district stops were sterile and well lit. The residential stations were quiet and peaceful, and the industrial area stops were gritty and functional. But Station 23 was different. Station 23 was officially called Riverside Park, though there was no park nearby anymore. It had been built in the 1960s to serve a residential neighborhood that had long since been torn down for urban renewal projects that never materialized. Now it was surrounded by empty lots and abandoned buildings, and barely a dozen people used the station on a typical day. The first time I noticed something unusual about Station 23, I thought it was just a system malfunction. I was approaching the station around 2:30 a.m. when I saw people on the platform. Quite a few people, actually maybe 20 or 30, all standing quietly and waiting for the train. This was unusual because Station 23 was typically deserted during the overnight hours. But cities have their rhythms, and sometimes events or circumstances can create unexpected crowds at odd hours. As I brought the train into the station, I got a better look at the waiting passengers. They were dressed strangely, in clothing that looked like it was from several decades ago. The men wore suits and fedoras, the women wore dresses with full skirts and small hats. Everyone looked like they were from the 1950s or early 1960s. But when I opened the doors, no one got on. I waited the standard 30 seconds, made the doors closing announcement, and shut the doors. As the train pulled away from the station, I looked back through the rear window. The platform was empty. I reported the incident to transit control, thinking maybe there had been some kind of historical reenactment event that had ended late, leaving costumed participants stranded at the station. But control had no record of any special events in that area. And the security cameras at Station 23 showed only my train arriving at and departing from an empty platform. 3 nights later, it happened again. Same time, same crowd of vintage-dressed passengers. Same result. No one boarded the train. This time, I decided to investigate further. After completing my route and returning to the depot, I looked up the history of Station 23 and the surrounding area. What I found explained everything, in the most disturbing way possible. In March of 1962, there had been a catastrophic accident at what was then called Riverside Park Station. A crowded evening rush hour train had derailed while entering the station, killing 37 passengers and injuring dozens more. The cause of the accident was eventually determined to be a combination of excessive speed and a problem with the track switching mechanism. The train operator, who survived the crash, reported that his brakes had failed as he approached the station. But here's the part that made my skin crawl. According to the accident report, the train that crashed had been running late. The passengers on the platform had been waiting longer than usual, and the platform was more crowded than normal because several earlier trains had been delayed due to mechanical problems. The people I was seeing on the platform were the victims of that 1962 crash, still waiting for a train that would never safely carry them to their destinations. Once I understood what I was seeing, I started approaching Station 23 differently during my overnight runs. Instead of just stopping briefly and moving on, I began opening the doors and waiting longer, giving the ghostly passengers time to board if they wanted to. But they never did. After several weeks of this routine, I decided to try speaking to them. One night, as I opened the doors to the empty platform that appeared full to my eyes, I made an announcement over the train's PA system. "Good evening, passengers. I know you've been waiting a long time for a safe ride. I want you to know that I'm a careful operator and this train is well maintained. You're welcome to board." For a moment, nothing happened. Then I felt the train car shift slightly, as if several people had stepped aboard. I closed the doors and continued to the next station, feeling an unusual heaviness in the train car, a sense of presence that hadn't been there before. At the next stop, I made another announcement. "Next stop, Downtown Central. This train is safe, and you'll arrive at your destination without any problems." I felt the train shift again, as if passengers were disembarking, and the sense of presence lightened. From that night forward, my routine changed. Every time I approached Station 23, I would stop and wait for the ghostly passengers from 1962 to board. I couldn't see them once they were on the train, but I could feel their presence, and I would give them the safe ride they had been denied all those years ago. Word of my unusual practice eventually reached my supervisor, who initially thought I was having some kind of psychological breakdown brought on by the isolation of night shift work. But when he reviewed my performance records, he discovered something interesting. My on-time performance had actually improved since I started the longer stops at Station 23, and passenger satisfaction surveys were consistently rating the red line is the safest and most reliable route in the system. Asterisk, whatever you're doing out there, he told me. Keep doing it. The numbers don't lie. Other operators started reporting their own experiences with the ghostly passengers at Station 23. Some saw them. Some just felt their presence. But everyone who worked the overnight Red Line shift eventually had some kind of encounter with the victims of the 1962 crash. And gradually, other changes began happening throughout the subway system. Mechanical problems became less frequent. Safety procedures were followed more carefully. Operators became more cautious and attentive. It was as if the spirits of the crash victims were somehow watching over the entire transit system, making sure that what happened to them would never happen to anyone else. I worked the overnight Red Line shift for 5 years, and during that time, the route had a perfect safety record. No accidents, no injuries, no mechanical failures that put passengers at risk. When I finally transferred to a day shift position on a different line, I left detailed notes for my replacement about the passengers at Station 23 and the importance of giving them the safe ride they deserved. The night shift taught me that some tragedies create a kind of protective presence, that victims of accidents sometimes become guardians, trying to prevent others from suffering the same fate. Every time I ride the subway now, I think about those passengers from 1962, still waiting on the platform at Station 23, still trusting that the next train will get them home safely. And I'm grateful for operators who understand that sometimes the most important passengers are the ones you can't see. Because in a city that never sleeps, we all depend on each other to make it through the night safely, whether we're among the living or the dead. Long-haul trucking at night is a different world than day driving. The highways belong to us after dark, stretching out like black rivers under the stars, marked only by the glow of truck stop signs and the occasional set of headlights coming the other way. I've been driving the overnight routes for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to produce across the western states. Most of the time, it's peaceful work. You've got your CB radio for company, your logbook to keep track of hours, and mile after mile of road to cover before dawn. But Interstate 40 through the Nevada desert has a passenger that other drivers don't talk about much. At least not until you've seen him yourself. They call him the hitchhiker, and he's been thumbing rides along that stretch of highway for over 30 years. I first encountered him on a Tuesday night in September, about 60 miles east of Reno. I was hauling a load of computer equipment to Salt Lake City, running behind schedule due to a delay at the loading dock, when I saw him standing on the shoulder of the road. He was maybe 40 years old, wearing jeans and a denim jacket, with a canvas duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Nothing unusual about his appearance, except that he was standing in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m., at least 50 miles from the nearest town. In the trucking community, there's an unwritten rule about picking up hitchhikers: don't do it. Too many insurance problems, too many liability issues, too many stories about drivers who tried to help someone and ended up robbed or worse. But something about this guy made me slow down. Maybe it was the way he stood perfectly still beside the road, not frantically waving for attention like most hitchhikers do. Or maybe it was the fact that his thumb wasn't even raised. He was just standing there, watching the traffic pass by, like he was waiting for something specific. I pulled over about 100 yards, past him, and waited to see if he would run to catch up with the truck. Most hitchhikers would sprint to reach a vehicle that had shown interest, but he didn't run. He walked slowly and deliberately, taking his time to cover the distance between where I'd seen him and where I'd stopped. When he reached the passenger side of the cab, he knocked on the door politely and waited for me to roll down the window. "Thanks for stopping," he said. His voice was quiet, polite, with a slight southern accent. "I'm heading east towards Salt Lake City. Can you give me a ride?" Something about the situation felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. The guy seemed harmless enough, and I had a long, boring drive ahead of me. Some company might be welcome. Sure, hop in, I said, unlocking the passenger door. He climbed into the cab with practiced ease, like he was used to riding in big rigs. He stowed his duffel bag on the floor and settled into the passenger seat without any of the awkward adjustments that most people need when they're not used to the height and layout of a truck cab. Name's Danny, he said, buckling his seatbelt. Danny Reeves. I appreciate the ride. No problem. I'm Mike. Where you headed in Salt Lake? Just passing through, Danny said. Got some business to take care of further east. We pulled back onto the highway, and for the first few miles, the conversation was normal small talk. Danny asked about the trucking life, mentioned that he'd done some driving himself years ago, talked about the changes he'd seen in the industry. But as we drove deeper into the Nevada desert, I started noticing things that didn't add up. First, Danny's clothes looked old-fashioned. Not vintage or retro, but genuinely old, like they were from a different era. His jeans had the kind of cut and stitching you'd see on pants from the 1980s, and his denim jacket had worn spots that suggested decades of use. Second, he didn't have any of the things you'd expect a modern hitchhiker to carry. No cell phone, no water bottle, no snacks. Just the canvas duffel bag, which he kept closed and never opened during our entire ride. Third, his knowledge of current events seemed limited. When I mentioned something about recent politics or technology, he would change the subject or give vague responses that didn't really address what I'd said. But the strangest thing was the way other drivers reacted to us on the CB radio. About an hour into the ride, my CB crackled to life with a transmission from another trucker. Eastbound big rig at mile marker 247. You've got a passenger in your cab. You might want to be careful. I keyed the microphone. Yeah, I picked up a hitchhiker. Seems like a decent guy. That's what they all think at first, came the reply. Just ... watch yourself, driver. That stretch of road has some history. Danny didn't seem to hear the CB conversation, or if he did, he didn't react to it. He just continued looking out the windshield at the empty desert, occasionally making comments about the landscape or asking questions about my route. As we approached the Utah state line, Danny started talking more about his past. I used to drive this route regular, he said. Back in the 80s, before the industry changed so much. Different world then. Drivers looked out for each other more, helped each other out. What kind of freight did you haul? I asked. Little bit of everything. Electronics, clothing, household goods. Made a good living at it, until... He trailed off, staring out at the dark highway ahead. Until what? Until I had some bad luck, real bad luck. Something in his tone made me glance over at him. In the green glow of the dashboard lights, Danny's face looked different somehow. Older, more worn, like he was carrying the weight of years that hadn't been visible before. What kind of bad luck? Danny was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You ever wonder what happens to drivers who don't make it to their destination? The question sent a chill down my spine. What do you mean? Accidents happen out here. Mechanical problems, health issues, other drivers who don't pay attention. Sometimes a trucker starts a run and never finishes it. I wanted to change the subject, but Danny continued. December 15th, 1987. I was hauling a load of Christmas merchandise from Los Angeles to Denver. Running late, trying to make up time. Weather was getting bad, snow starting to fall. He paused, still staring ahead. About 30 miles east of where you picked me up tonight, my truck hit a patch of black ice. Lost control, went off the road. Rolled 3 times before coming to rest in a ravine about a quarter mile from the highway. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Danny ... Took them 4 days to find the wreckage. By then, it was too late. I died on impact, they said. Never felt a thing. I looked over at the passenger seat. Danny was still there, but now I could see through him slightly, like he was becoming transparent. But here's the thing about dying on the road, he continued. his voice becoming fainter. "Sometimes you don't realize you're dead. Sometimes you keep trying to complete your run, keep trying to get your load delivered on time." The cab of the truck was getting colder, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. For 30 years, I've been trying to finish that last run. Catching rides with drivers like you, trying to get to Denver to deliver a load of Christmas toys that rotted in that ravine decades ago. I wanted to pull over, to stop the truck and figure out what was happening, but something kept me driving forward. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Danny's voice was barely a whisper now. "Because tonight's different. Tonight, I finally understand that the load doesn't matter anymore. Those Christmas toys were replaced 30 years ago. The stores that were waiting for them have closed down. The kids who would have played with them are grown up now." I looked over at the passenger seat. Danny was fading away, becoming more and more transparent. "I've been holding on to something that doesn't need to be delivered anymore," he said. "It's time to let go." As we crossed the Utah state line, Danny Reeves disappeared completely. The passenger seat was empty, the cab warmed up, and the only evidence that he'd been there at all was a slight indentation in the seat cushion. Drove the rest of the way to Salt Lake City in stunned silence, trying to process what I'd experienced. When I arrived at the delivery dock, I mentioned Danny to the dock supervisor, an old-timer who'd been in the industry for decades. Danny Reeves, he said thoughtfully. "Yeah, I remember that accident. Terrible thing. Danny was a good driver, real professional. Everyone was shocked when it happened." He paused, looking at me curiously. "Why do you ask?" "That was a long time ago. No reason," I said. "Just heard the name somewhere." I've driven that stretch of I-40 through Nevada dozens of times since that night, but I've never seen Danny Reeves standing on the shoulder again. And according to other drivers I've talked to, neither has anyone else. I think Danny finally completed his last run that night, not by delivering his cargo, but by understanding that some deliveries don't need to be made. Sometimes the most important thing a driver can do is know when it's time to park the truck and go home. The night shift teaches you that the road is full of people trying to get from one place to another, and not all of them are among the living. But whether you're hauling freight or just looking for a ride, we all deserve to reach our destination eventually, even if it takes 30 years to figure out where that destination really is. Al's All-Night Diner was the kind of place that existed. In every small town across America, red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, a counter with spinning stools, and a grill that had been cooking burgers and eggs since the Eisenhower administration. Located on Highway 50 about 40 miles outside of Springfield, Al served truckers, late night travelers, and shift workers from the nearby manufacturing plants. During the day, it was a busy spot with regular customers who knew each other's names and usual orders. But from midnight to 6 a.m., I was the only cook, working alone in the kitchen while Sarah, the night waitress, handled the dining room. I'd been working the graveyard shift at Al's for about 8 months when I first encountered what I came to think of as the regular customer. It was a Thursday night in November, around 3 a.m., when Sarah poked her head through the serving window between the kitchen and dining room. "Mike, I need a number 3 with scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and coffee," she said. A number 3 was our standard breakfast. 2 eggs, hash browns, and choice of bacon or sausage. Nothing unusual about the order, except for one thing. "Who's it for?" I asked, looking out at the dining room. I could see the entire restaurant from my position at the grill, and there were only 2 customers, a trucker at the counter nursing a cup of coffee and reading a paperback novel, and an elderly woman in booth 4 who was already halfway through a piece of apple pie. "Booth 7, Sarah said. "Guy just came in." I looked at booth 7. It was empty. "I don't see anyone in booth 7, I told Sarah. She looked back at the booth, then back at me with a confused expression. "That's weird. He was just there." "Middle-aged guy." wearing a work shirt and a baseball cap. Said he was passing through town. I shrugged and started cooking the order. Maybe the customer had stepped outside to make a phone call or use the restroom. It wouldn't be the first time someone had placed an order and then disappeared temporarily. But when I finished cooking the breakfast and Sarah went to deliver it, booth 7 was still empty. "This is really strange," Sarah said, returning to the kitchen with the untouched plate. "I could have sworn there was a customer there. I even took his coffee order." We ended up eating the breakfast ourselves during our break, but the incident stuck with me. 3 nights later, it happened again. Same order, same booth, same invisible customer. This time, I decided to pay closer attention. When Sarah said she needed a number 3 for booth 7, I wiped my hands on my apron and walked out into the dining room to see for myself. Booth 7 appeared empty to my eyes, but as I stood there looking at it, I became aware of a presence. The booth's vinyl seat was slightly compressed, as if someone was sitting there. There was a coffee cup on the table that I hadn't seen Sarah pour, and a faint smell of motor oil and cigarettes hung in the air. "Can I help you with something?" I asked the empty booth. Sarah looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I continued staring at booth 7, waiting for some kind of response. After a moment, I heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Just the usual, if you don't mind. Been a long night." The voice was male, tired sounding, with a slight Midwestern accent. I went back to the kitchen and cooked the number 3, but this time I did something different. Instead of just preparing it according to Sarah's specifications, I cooked it the way my intuition told me to. Eggs over easy instead of scrambled, bacon instead of sausage, and I added a side of grits that hadn't been requested. When Sarah delivered the plate to booth 7, something remarkable happened. The food began disappearing, slowly but steadily, as if someone was eating it. The coffee cup emptied and refilled itself from the pot Sarah had left on the table. 20 minutes later, the plate was clean, the coffee was gone, and a $5 bill appeared on the table next to a handwritten note. "Thanks for the good food. See you next week." I kept that note, and I started researching the history of Al's Diner and the surrounding area. What I discovered was a story that explained everything. In 1973, a man named Bobby Hartwell had been a regular customer at Al's. He worked the night shift at a plastics factory about 15 miles down the road, and he would stop by the diner every Thursday night after work for breakfast before heading home. Bobby always sat in booth 7, always ordered the same thing, 2 eggs over easy, bacon, hash browns, wheat toast, grits, and coffee. He'd been coming to Al's for over 10 years, and the staff knew him well enough to start cooking his order as soon as they saw his headlights pull into the parking lot. In December of 1973, Bobby was driving home from Al's when his car hit a patch of ice and skidded off Highway 50 into a drainage ditch. He was found the next morning, dead from injuries sustained in the crash. But here's the touching part. Bobby had been so devoted to his weekly routine that he'd left work early that Thursday night to make sure he could get to Al's before his usual waitress ended her shift. He'd wanted to wish her a Merry Christmas and give her the holiday tip he'd saved up for her. The tip money was found in his jacket pocket after the accident, along with a Christmas card addressed to Linda and the crew at Al's. "Thanks for always making me feel welcome." Bobby Hartwell had died trying to complete his weekly ritual of coming to Al's for breakfast, and apparently he'd never stopped. Once I understood who I was cooking for, I started looking forward to Thursday nights. Bobby became my most reliable customer, showing up like clockwork around 3 a.m., always ordering the same breakfast, always leaving exact change and a polite note. But Bobby wasn't just there for the food. Over the weeks and months that followed, I realized he was also watching out for the diner and its customers. On nights when we had difficult or threatening customers, Bobby's presence seemed to have a calming effect. Drunk truckers would sober up quickly in booth 7's vicinity. Rowdy teenagers would quiet down when they sat near Bobby's usual spot. And more than once, I saw aggressive customers suddenly decide to pay their bills and leave after spending a few minutes in the area where Bobby sat. Sarah eventually became aware of Bobby's presence too, though she never quite got used to it. "It's like having a guardian angel in booth 7, she told me one night. "I feel safer knowing he's here, even if I can't see him." Bobby's influence extended beyond just maintaining order in the dining room. The diner's atmosphere began to change, becoming more welcoming and friendly. Regular customers started lingering longer, engaging in conversations with strangers, helping each other out with directions or recommendations. That it was as if Bobby's spirit of community and routine was contagious, reminding people that diners like Al's were more than just places to grab a quick meal. They were gathering spots, refuges for people traveling through the night, places where everyone was welcomed. One Thursday night in March, almost a year after I'd first encountered Bobby, something different happened. His order arrived as usual, but instead of the typical note about good food and service, he left a longer message. "Mike, thanks for always cooking my breakfast the way I like it, even though I never got to tell you how to make it right. You understand what this place means to people like me, folks who work the night shift and need somewhere to feel at home. Keep taking care of the travelers and the late-night workers. They need places like this more than you know. BH." That was the last note Bobby ever left. He continued to visit booth 7 every Thursday night, but the written messages stopped. I worked at Al's for 3 more years, and during that time, the diner developed a reputation as one of the friendliest truck stops on Highway 50. Drivers would go out of their way to eat there, not just for the food but for the atmosphere. When I finally moved on to other opportunities, I left detailed instructions for my replacement about Bobby's weekly visits and his preferred breakfast preparation. I wanted to make sure that even if I wasn't there to cook for him, Bobby would still get his usual order prepared the right way. The night shift taught me that some routines are so important to people that they transcend death. Bobby Hartwell had found a place where he felt welcome and appreciated, and not even a fatal car accident could keep him away from his weekly breakfast at Al's. Every time I pass a small-town diner late at night, I think about Bobby and all the other night shift workers who depend on these places for more than just food. They need community, routine, and the comfort of knowing that somewhere along their route, somebody is waiting to serve them a good meal and treat them like family. Because in the end, we all need a place where we can sit down, order the usual, and know that we belong. The Meridian Corporate Center was a sleek, 12-story office building that housed accounting firms, law offices, marketing agencies, and various other professional services. During business hours, it buzzed with activity, but after 6 p.m., it became my responsibility to clean and maintain every floor, every office, every conference room. Working as a night custodian in a corporate building is mostly solitary work. You have your cart full of cleaning supplies, your keys to every room, and floor after floor of empty offices to work through. Most nights, the building was completely quiet except for the hum of computers that were left running and the occasional ring of a phone that someone forgot to forward to voicemail. I'd been working at Meridian for about 6 months when I first noticed the activity on the 8th floor. The 8th floor housed Morrison and Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm that specialized in small business financial services. During tax season, they worked long hours and generated more trash and required more frequent cleaning than most of the other offices in the building. But tax season was over, and Morrison and Associates should have been operating on normal business hours, which made it strange that their offices showed signs of recent activity every morning when I arrived for my shift. It started with small things. Computer monitors that I was certain I had turned off would be on when I returned the next night. Papers that I had left neatly stacked on desks would be scattered around. Coffee cups would be sitting in the break room sink, still warm with fresh coffee stains. At first, I thought maybe some of the employees were working late or coming in during the evening hours to catch up on projects. But when I mentioned it to the building security guard, he told me that his log showed no after-hours access to the 8th floor for over a month. Maybe someone's got a key they're not supposed to have, he suggested. Or maybe the employees are forgetting to log in with security when they stay late. But the more I paid attention to the pattern of activity, the more strange it became. The signs of recent work were always concentrated in the same area of the office. 3 desks in the northeast corner of the floor, near the windows that overlooked the city. One night in July, I decided to investigate more systematically. Instead of cleaning the 8th floor at my usual time around 2 a.m., I decided to start there at the beginning of my shift and see if I could catch whoever was using the office after hours. I took the elevator up to the 8th floor at 10:30 p.m. and used my key to enter the Morrison & Associates office suite. The reception area was dark and quiet, but I could see light coming from the back corner of the office, the same area where I'd been noticing signs of activity. I walked quietly toward the light, expecting to find employees working late or maybe someone who wasn't supposed to be there at all. What I found was much stranger. 3 people were sitting at desks in the northeast corner, working intently on what appeared to be financial documents and tax forms. They were dressed in business attire from what looked like the 1980s or early 1990s. The women wore blazers with large shoulder pads and skirts, while the man wore a gray suit with a wide tie. But here's what made the scene surreal. I could see through them, like they were projected images rather than solid people. As I stood there watching, one of the women looked up from her paperwork and seemed to notice me. "Oh, hello," she said, her voice sounding distant and slightly echoing. "You must be the new night custodian. I'm Janet Morrison. I'm one of the partners here." I didn't know what to say. I was looking at a ghost who was introducing herself like we were meeting at a normal business networking event. "I'm sorry if we're in your way," Janet continued. "We're just trying to finish up some client work that's been pending for longer than we'd like to admit." One of the other figures, a man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his desk. "How long have we been working on the Henderson account?" he asked Janet. "I'm not sure," she replied, looking confused. "What year is it now?" I found my voice. "It's 2018, I said. All 3 of the ghostly figures stopped working and stared at me. 2018, Janet repeated. "That can't be right. We were just finishing up the 1993 tax returns." I realized I was talking to people who had died 25 years ago, but were still trying to complete their work. Over the following weeks, I researched the history of Morrison & Associates and discovered the tragic story behind what I was witnessing. In April of 1993, Janet Morrison, Harold Peterson, and Susan Chun had been working late to finish tax returns before the filing deadline. They had stayed in the office until nearly midnight, trying to complete several complicated small business returns. While they were working, a fire had started in the building's electrical system on the 7th floor. The 3 accountants, focused on their work and unaware of the danger, had become trapped when the fire spread to the stairwells and elevators. They had died of smoke inhalation, found at their desks the next morning, still working on client tax returns that would never be filed. And apparently, they had never realized they were dead. Once I understood the situation, I started interacting with Janet, Harold, and Susan more regularly. They were polite, professional, and completely dedicated to their work, but they seemed confused about the passage of time and unaware that their clients had long since found other accountants. Tried to explain to them that they had died in the fire, but they couldn't seem to process that information. They would nod politely when I mentioned it, then immediately return to discussing client deadlines and tax code changes. But I noticed that their work seemed to be having a positive effect on the living employees at Morrison & Associates. Current staff began reporting that their computers ran more smoothly, that financial calculations seemed to work out more easily, and that they were finding fewer errors in their client work. The office atmosphere became more productive and collaborative. It was as if Janet, Harold, and Susan's dedication to accuracy in client service was somehow improving the work of their successors. One night, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of trying to convince them they were dead, I brought them current information about tax law changes and modern accounting practices. "I thought you might be interested in these updates," I said, placing some recent IRS publications on Janet's desk. Her face lit up. "Oh, wonderful. We've been using the 1993 tax code, and we were wondering if there had been any changes." Over the next few months, I continued bringing them updated information, new tax forms, current accounting software manuals, recent changes to business regulations. The three ghost accountants absorbed this information eagerly, and their work became more sophisticated and modern. But more importantly, they began to understand that time had passed and that their original clients no longer needed their services. One night in November, Janet approached me as I was cleaning their work area. "We've been thinking," she said, "about what you've told us about the passage of time. We realize now that our clients from 1993 have probably moved on to other accountants." "That's right," I said gently. "But we also realize that there are new clients now, people who need the same kind of careful attention to detail that we always provided." I nodded, wondering where this was leading. "We'd like to help the current staff here," Janet continued. "Not by doing their work for them, but by sharing our knowledge and experience. Would that be appropriate?" From that night forward, the three ghost accountants changed their approach. Instead of trying to complete outdated tax returns, they began leaving helpful notes for the living staff, reminders about tax deadlines, suggestions for more efficient workflow, tips for catching common errors. The current employees at Morrison and Associates began finding these notes on their desks in the morning and assumed they were coming from particularly helpful colleagues. The office became known for its exceptional accuracy and attention to detail. Janet, Harold, and Susan had found a way to continue serving clients while accepting that their original work was no longer relevant. I worked at the Meridian Corporate Center for 2 more years, and during that time, the three ghost accountants gradually became less visible and less interactive. But their influence on the office continued to be felt in the improved quality of work and the collaborative atmosphere among the staff. When I finally moved on to another job, I left a note for my replacement explaining about the helpful spirits on the 8th floor and their dedication to excellent client service. The night shift taught me that some people are so committed to their work that they continue doing it, even after death. But the most remarkable thing about Janet, Harold, and Susan was their ability to adapt their dedication to changing circumstances, finding new ways to help others even when their original purpose was no longer relevant. Not all workaholics are driven by unhealthy obsessions. Sometimes they're just people who genuinely care about doing good work and helping others succeed. Point Meridian Lighthouse had been guiding ships safely to harbor for over a century, but by the time I started working there, it had been automated for 15 years. My job as the night maintenance technician was to monitor the automated systems, perform routine equipment checks, and handle any emergencies that might arise with the beacon or fog signals. The lighthouse stood on a rocky outcropping about 2 miles from the mainland, connected by a narrow causeway that was impassable during high tide and rough weather. During my 12-hour overnight shifts from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., I was often completely cut off from the outside world. The lighthouse living quarters had been converted into a small maintenance facility and monitoring station. I had all the modern equipment I needed: radio communications, computer terminals showing shipping traffic, and automated diagnostics for all the lighthouse systems. But the building still retained much of its original character. The spiral staircase that led to the beacon room, the thick stone walls that had weathered countless storms, and the small windows that provided panoramic views of the ocean and coastline. I'd been working at Point Meridian for about 2 months when I first encountered Captain William Morrison. Was doing my routine 2 a.m. equipment check, climbing the spiral staircase to inspect the beacon mechanism, when I heard footsteps on the metal stairs above me. This was impossible, because I was the only person in the lighthouse, and the staircase only led to the beacon room at the top of the tower. I called out, "Hello? Is someone up there?" The footsteps stopped, but there was no response. I continued climbing until I reached the beacon room. The space was empty except for the massive rotating light mechanism in the windows that surrounded the circular room. But I could smell something that shouldn't have been there. Pipe tobacco, the sweet, rich scent of a blend that hadn't been popular for decades. I completed my inspection and headed back down the stairs. But as I descended, I heard the footsteps again, this time coming from below me, as if someone was walking up while I was walking down. I stopped and listened carefully. The footsteps continued for a moment, then stopped when I stopped, like someone was mirroring my movements. "This is getting weird," I muttered to myself, and continued down to the monitoring station. The next night, I decided to research the history of Point Meridian Lighthouse and its keepers. What I found was a story of dedication that extended far beyond normal job requirements. Captain William Morrison had been the lighthouse keeper from 1952 to 1987, a span of 35 years. He had lived in the lighthouse with his wife Margaret, maintaining the beacon and fog signals, providing assistance to ships in distress, and serving as an unofficial Coast Guard station for the local area. Captain Morrison had been legendary among local sailors for his commitment to keeping the light burning and ships safe. He had stayed at his post during hurricanes, ice storms, and equipment failures that would have defeated less dedicated keepers. In 1987, at the age of 72, Captain Morrison had suffered a heart attack while climbing the spiral staircase to repair a problem with the beacon during a severe storm. He had been found the next morning, still clutching the tools he needed to complete the repair. The lighthouse had been automated shortly after his death, but according to local maritime records, Point Meridian had maintained a perfect safety record since then. No ships had been lost or damaged due to lighthouse failure, even during severe weather events that had caused problems at other automated facilities along the coast. Now, I understood who I was sharing the lighthouse with, and why the footsteps always seemed to be moving toward the beacon room. Captain Morrison was still making his rounds, still checking the equipment, still ensuring that the light would guide ships safely to harbor. Over the following weeks, I began to notice other signs of Captain Morrison's presence. Tools that I had left in the monitoring station would be found in the beacon room, arranged in the precise order needed for specific maintenance tasks. Equipment problems that should have required hours of troubleshooting would somehow resolve themselves overnight. And during severe weather, when the automated systems were stressed to their limits, everything seemed to run more smoothly than the technical specifications suggested was possible. I started leaving notes for Captain Morrison, updating him on the status of the modern equipment and thanking him for his continued assistance. To my surprise, I began finding responses written in the lighthouse logbook, in old-fashioned handwriting with a fountain pen. Equipment running well. Minor adjustment needed on fog signal timing mechanism. Weather system approaching from northwest. Expected arrival 0300 hours. Will monitor beacon performance during storm. The entries were always professional, precise, and focused on the lighthouse's operational status. But the most remarkable thing about Captain Morrison's ghostly presence was the way it affected the local maritime community. Ships passing Point Meridian began reporting unusually clear radio communications with the lighthouse, even though the automated system wasn't equipped with voice transmission capabilities. Vessel operators claimed they were receiving helpful navigation updates and weather warnings that weren't coming from the Coast Guard or other official sources. And during emergencies, something extraordinary would happen. I witnessed this firsthand. During a November storm when a fishing vessel lost power about 3 miles offshore. The boat was drifting toward the rocky coastline, and the Coast Guard rescue team was still 40 minutes away. I was monitoring the situation on my radio when I heard a voice I didn't recognize transmitting on the emergency frequency. Fishing. Vessel Sandra Marie, this is Point Meridian Light Station. I can guide you to safe anchorage in the harbor channel. Adjust your heading to 270 degrees and deploy your anchor at my signal. I looked at my radio equipment. The transmission wasn't coming from my station. Over the next 20 minutes, the mysterious voice provided precise navigation instructions, tide information, and anchoring guidance that safely brought the Sandra Marie into protected waters until the Coast Guard arrived. When I reviewed the incident with the Coast Guard the next day, they had no record of any official transmissions from Point Meridian Lighthouse. But the fishing vessel's captain was certain that someone at the lighthouse had saved his boat and possibly his life. I realized that Captain Morrison wasn't just maintaining the lighthouse equipment. He was actively using his knowledge and experience to continue protecting ships and sailors, even though he was no longer officially on duty. Word of these mysterious helpful transmissions spread through the maritime community, and Point Meridian Lighthouse developed a reputation as the most reliable navigation aid on the coast. Ship captains would go out of their way to pass within sight of the lighthouse, knowing that if they encountered problems, they could count on receiving expert assistance. One night, as I was completing my shift and preparing for my relief to arrive, I decided to climb to the beacon room and speak directly to Captain Morrison. The beacon was rotating steadily, its powerful beam sweeping across the dark ocean. I could feel the captain's presence more strongly than ever in that circular room, surrounded by windows. "Captain Morrison," I said, "I want you to know that I understand what you're doing here, and I'm honored to work alongside you. Your dedication to keeping sailors safe is remarkable." For a moment, the beacon seemed to pause in its rotation, and I heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. "The sea never sleeps, son. Neither can we." I worked at Point Meridian Lighthouse for 5 more years, and during that time, the facility maintained its perfect safety record. Captain Morrison and I developed an effective partnership. I handled the modern technical requirements, while he provided the experience and intuitive knowledge that no automated system could replicate. When I finally transferred to a different position, I left detailed notes for my replacement about Captain Morrison's continued presence and his ongoing commitment to maritime safety. The night shift taught me that some forms of service are so fundamental to a person's identity that they transcend death. Captain Morrison had dedicated his life to keeping the lighthouse operational and ships safe, and his spirit couldn't rest while there was still work to be done. Every time I see a lighthouse now, whether it's automated or still staffed by living keepers, I think about Captain Morrison and all the other guardians who have dedicated their lives to keeping travelers safe. The sea never sleeps, and neither do the people who have sworn to protect those who venture onto it. Driving a cab on the night shift in Chicago meant dealing with everything the city had to offer after dark. Drunks stumbling out of bars, shift workers heading home from factories, people with emergencies who needed to get across town fast, and the occasional fare who made you question whether picking them up had been a good idea. I'd been driving nights for Yellow Cab Company for about 3 years when I first encountered the fare who couldn't pay with money. It was a rainy Thursday night in October, around 2:45 a.m., when I got a call to pick up someone at Graceland Cemetery. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "Car 47. Pickup at Graceland Cemetery, main entrance on Clark Street." Graceland Cemetery at almost 3 a.m. was an unusual pickup location, but I'd learned not to ask too many questions about where people needed rides from. Chicago never slept, and people had their reasons for being wherever they were. I pulled up to the main entrance and waited. The cemetery gates were locked, but I could see someone walking toward me from inside the grounds. Moving slowly through the rain. As the figure got closer, I could make out more details. It was a woman, maybe in her 30s, wearing a long coat that looked like it was from several decades ago. Her hair was styled in victory rolls, the kind of elaborate updo that women wore in the 1940s. She approached the passenger door and knocked softly on the window. I rolled it down. "You call for a cab?" "Yes," she said, her voice soft and polite. "I need to go to the Palmer House Hotel, please." She got into the back seat, and I started the meter. The Palmer House was downtown, maybe a 20-minute drive depending on traffic. As we drove through the quiet streets, I tried to make conversation. "Kind of late to be visiting the cemetery," I said. "I wasn't visiting," she replied. "I was leaving." Something about the way she said it made me glance at her in the rearview mirror. She was sitting perfectly still, staring out the window at the passing city lights. "You work nearby?" I asked. "I used to work at the Palmer House," she said. "I was a switchboard operator there. I'm hoping they'll give me my job back." The Palmer House Hotel had modernized its telephone systems decades ago. They hadn't used human switchboard operators since the 1960s, at least. But I didn't say anything. When we arrived at the Palmer House, I looked at the meter, $18.40. "That'll be $18.40, I said. The woman in the back seat didn't move to reach for a purse or wallet. Instead, she said, "I don't have any money with me, but I have something else I can give you." She leaned forward and placed something on the partition between the front and back seats. It was a small silver locket on a delicate chain. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said. "It's real silver, probably worth more than the fare. I promise I'll come back for it when I get my first paycheck." I picked up the locket and examined. It was definitely old, beautifully crafted, with intricate engravings on the front. Inside, there was a tiny photograph of a young couple in wedding attire, from what looked like the early 1900s. "Are you sure you want to leave this?" I asked. "It looks like it has sentimental value." "I'm sure," she said, getting out of the cab. "Thank you for the ride." I watched her walk through the hotel's revolving door, then drove away, still holding the silver locket. The next morning, I took the locket to a jewelry shop to get it appraised, mostly out of curiosity. The jeweler examined it carefully and gave me some surprising news. "This is a beautiful piece," he said. "Probably dates from around 1920, solid silver with hand-engraved details. The photograph inside looks original to the piece. I'd estimate its value at around $300. That was far more than the $18 cab fare, and I felt guilty about keeping something so valuable. I decided to return to the Palmer House and see if I could find the woman to give back the locket. At the hotel, I asked the desk clerk if a woman in a 1940s-style coat had inquired about switchboard operator positions. The clerk looked confused. "We don't have switchboard operators here, sir. Haven't for decades. All our calls are handled by an automated system." I described the woman in more detail, but the clerk couldn't recall anyone matching that description. That evening, I did some research on the history of the Palmer House Hotel and its employees. What I found explained everything, in a way that made my skin crawl. In March of 1943, a young woman named Dorothy Shun had worked as a switchboard operator at the Palmer House. She lived alone in a small apartment near the hotel and walked to work every day. One night, Dorothy had been working the late shift when she received word that her fiancé, a soldier stationed in the Pacific, had been killed in action. Overwhelmed by grief, she had left the hotel during her shift and walked to Graceland Cemetery, where her grandparents were buried. Dorothy was found the next morning, having taken her own life beside her grandparents' grave. She was wearing her grandmother's silver locket, the only valuable thing she owned. The newspaper article mentioned that Dorothy had been a dedicated employee who took pride in her work and had hoped to save enough money to move to California after the war ended, realized that I had given Dorothy Chun a ride from her grave to the job she'd been trying to return to for over 70 years. But the story didn't end there. 3 nights later, I got another call to Graceland Cemetery. Same location, same time. Same passenger. Dorothy got into the cab wearing the same 1940s coat, her hair styled in the same victory rolls. "Palmer House Hotel, please," she said, just as she had before. This time, I was ready for her. "Dorothy," I said, "I know who you are. And I know about what happened to you in 1943. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You kept my locket." "Yes, I had it appraised. It's worth quite a lot of money. More than you needed to pay for the ride." "I thought it might be," she said. "My grandmother always told me it was valuable. I just never had a reason to sell it before." As we drove downtown, I tried to explain to Dorothy that the world had changed, that the Palmer House didn't use switchboard operators anymore, that the war had ended decades ago, but she seemed unable to process that information. "I just need to get back to work," she kept saying. "They'll be wondering where I went. I can't afford to lose this job." When we arrived at the Palmer House, instead of asking for payment, I turned around and handed Dorothy her locket. "Keep this," I said. "It's yours, and it's more valuable than any cab fare." She took the locket and held it carefully in her hands. "But I still need to pay you for the ride. The ride's on me," I said. "Consider it a favor from one night shift worker to another." Dorothy smiled, the first time I'd seen any emotion on her face other than anxiety. "Thank you," she said. "That's very kind of you." She got out of the cab and walked toward the hotel entrance. But this time, instead of going inside, she stopped at the revolving door and looked back at me. She raised her hand in a small wave, then walked away down the street, disappearing into the early morning shadows. I never got another call to pick up Dorothy Chun from Graceland Cemetery, but I started noticing something interesting about my other fares. People who got into my cab seemed more willing to help each other out, more understanding about payment problems, more patient with delays or detours. It was as if Dorothy's gratitude for the kindness I'd shown her was somehow spreading to other passengers, creating a more compassionate atmosphere in the cab. I worked as a night shift taxi driver for 2 more years, and during that time, I had dozens of passengers who couldn't pay full fare for one reason or another. Following Dorothy's example, I started accepting alternative forms of payment: family photographs, handwritten poems, small personal items that meant more to the passengers than their monetary value. I kept a box in my apartment filled with these payments: a child's drawing from a single mother rushing to the hospital, a military medal from a veteran who needed a ride to a job interview, a wedding ring from a woman escaping an abusive relationship. Each item represented someone who needed help during a difficult time, someone who was grateful for kindness from a stranger. The night shift taught me that some debts can't be paid with money, and some payments are worth more than cash. Dorothy Chun had been trying to return to work for 70 years, not because she was trapped by her death, but because she had been raised to believe that honest work and paying your debts were the most important things in life. When I showed her that kindness and understanding were more valuable than strict adherence to rules, she was finally able to rest. Every time I see a taxi now, I think about Dorothy and all the other people who work through the night to help strangers get where they need to go. We're all just trying to make it through another shift, whether we're alive or dead. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is show each other a little compassion along the way. Metro General Hospital was a sprawling complex that never truly slept. Even during the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, there were always nurses making rounds, residents catching naps between emergencies, and patients dealing with the restless anxiety that comes with being sick and away from home. As the night shift head of custodial services, I supervised a team of 12 janitors who cleaned and maintained the hospital's 7 buildings. We worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., moving through the halls with our carts and equipment, trying to stay invisible while keeping the medical facility spotless and functional. Building C housed the pediatric ward, and it was always the most challenging part of our nightly routine. Sick children create different kinds of messes than adult patients, and the emotional weight of working around suffering kids made it the assignment nobody wanted. That's why I usually took Building C. Myself, I'd been working at Metro General for almost 2 years when I first encountered the volunteer who never went home. It was a Tuesday night in November, around 1:30 a.m., when I saw her in the pediatric ward's playroom. She was a woman in her 60s, wearing a pink volunteer smock, sitting in a child-sized chair and reading a storybook aloud to an empty room. The playroom was supposed to be empty at that hour. All the children were in their rooms, hopefully sleeping, and visiting hours had ended at 9 p.m. I knocked softly on the doorframe. "Excuse me, ma'am, but the ward is closed to visitors right now." She looked up from the book with a gentle smile. "Oh, I'm not a visitor. I'm a volunteer, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman. I read stories to the children." "I understand, but visiting hours ended several hours ago. I'm going to have to ask you to leave so I can clean the playroom." Mrs. Whitman looked confused. "But the children need their bedtime stories. Some of them can't sleep without hearing a story first." I walked into the playroom to get a better look at her. That's when I noticed something strange. I could see through her, just slightly, as if she were a projection rather than a solid person. "Mrs. Whitman," I said carefully, "what time do you think it is?" "Oh, it's story time," she replied. "It's always story time somewhere in the hospital. The children here are so far from home, and they need to know that someone cares about them." Over the next few nights, I encountered Mrs. Whitman several more times. Always in the pediatric ward, always reading stories, always wearing the pink volunteer smock that identified her as an official hospital volunteer. But when I checked with the volunteer coordinator the next morning, there was no Eleanor Whitman on the current volunteer roster. I started asking the pediatric nurses about her, and what I learned was both touching and sad. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman had been a volunteer at Metro General for over 15 years. From 1998 to 2013, she had come to the hospital 3 days a week to read stories to sick children, organize craft activities, and provide comfort to kids who were scared and lonely. Eleanor had been especially dedicated to the children who had long-term illnesses or who didn't have family members who could visit regularly. She would spend hours with these kids, reading books, playing games, and just listening when they needed someone to talk to. In December of 2013, Eleanor had suffered a stroke while volunteering in the pediatric ward. She had been found in the playroom, collapsed beside a chair where she'd been reading to a little boy with leukemia. Eleanor died at the hospital she had served for so many years, and her funeral had been attended by dozens of families whose children she had helped during their most difficult times. But apparently, Eleanor's sense of responsibility to the children had been stronger than death. Once I understood who Mrs. Whitman was, I started paying closer attention to her activities. She wasn't just reading to empty rooms. She was visiting specific children, the ones who were having the hardest time sleeping, the ones who cried for their mothers, the ones who were scared about upcoming procedures. The pediatric nurses started reporting that their most difficult patients were sleeping better, crying less, and showing improved cooperation with medical treatments. "It's the strangest thing," one nurse told me. "We've got kids who were having terrible nightmares, and suddenly they're sleeping through the night. They say someone comes to read them stories and tells them everything's going to be okay." I realized that Eleanor was still doing exactly what she had done when she was alive, providing comfort and support to children who needed it most. But I also noticed that Eleanor seemed confused about the passage of time and unaware that she was dead. One night I decided to have a longer conversation with her. I found her in the playroom. As usual, surrounded by picture books and stuffed animals. "Mrs. Whitman," I said, sitting down in one of the tiny chairs across from her. "Can you tell me about your work here?" She smiled warmly. "Oh, I love working with the children. They're so brave, you know. Much braver than most adults would be in their situation." "How long have you been volunteering here?" "Let's see," she said, looking thoughtful. "I started after my husband passed away. He'd been sick for a long time, and I spent so many hours in hospitals with him. I decided I wanted to help other families going through difficult times." "Do you remember what year that was?" Eleanor frowned. "Time gets a bit fuzzy when you're my age, dear. But I know I've been here quite a while. Long enough to see children grow up and come back to visit, long enough to learn which stories work best for different ages." I spent the next hour talking with Eleanor about her volunteer work, her stories, about individual children she'd helped, and her deep commitment to making the hospital experience less frightening for sick kids. What became clear was that Eleanor's identity was so tied up in her volunteer work that she couldn't imagine not being needed by the children. "What would happen to them if I wasn't here?" she asked. "Some of these children don't have anyone else to read to them, anyone else who has time to just sit and listen when they're scared." I realized that Eleanor couldn't move on because she believed the children still needed her in the same way they had when she was alive. But I also realized that she was right. The children did still need her, just not in the way she thought. Over the following weeks, I started leaving notes for Eleanor, updating her on changes in the hospital and the pediatric ward. I told her about the new family support programs that had been implemented, the child life specialists who now worked with scared children, the improvements in pain management that made kids more comfortable. Gradually, Eleanor began to understand that the pediatric ward had evolved since her time there, that new resources and support systems had been put in place to help children and families. "It sounds like the hospital has gotten much better at taking care of the whole child, not just their medical condition," she said one night. "That's right," I said. "A lot of that improvement came from volunteers like you who showed how important it is to address children's emotional needs, not just their physical health." Eleanor smiled. "So in a way, the work I did helped create these new programs." "Absolutely. Your example showed everyone how much difference it makes when someone takes time to comfort a scared child." That night was the last time I saw Eleanor Whitman in the pediatric ward, but the positive changes she had brought to the children's experiences continued. The pediatric ward at Metro General developed a reputation for exceptional patient satisfaction, particularly in the area of emotional support and family services. New volunteers were recruited specifically to continue the kind of work Eleanor had done, reading stories, organizing activities, and providing comfort to children who were away from home and scared about their medical treatment. I worked at Metro General for 3 more years, and during that time, the hospital received several awards for excellence in pediatric care, particularly recognizing their innovative approach to addressing the emotional and psychological needs of young patients. When I finally moved on to another position, I left a note for my replacement about Mrs. Eleanor Whitman and her continued dedication to the children. Even after death, the night shift taught me that some people care so deeply about helping others that their compassion transcends death. Eleanor Whitman couldn't rest until she was sure that the children she'd dedicated her life to serving would continue to receive the comfort and support they needed. But the most beautiful thing about Eleanor's story is that her influence continued to grow even after she was gone. The example she set during her 15 years of volunteer work inspired changes that helped thousands of children long after her death. Every time I visit a hospital now and see volunteers reading to children or playing games with young patients, I think about Eleanor and the legacy of kindness that people like her leave behind. The night shift may be when the hospital is quietest, but it's also when you're most likely to encounter the spirits of people who cared so much about helping others that they never really left. City Transit Route 47 ran from downtown to the industrial district on the east side, a 40-minute trip through neighborhoods that had seen better days. During evening rush hour, the bus would be packed with factory workers, retail employees, and students heading home. But on the overnight shift, Route 47 carried a different kind of passenger, people working late shifts, those without cars who needed to get around the city after midnight, and the occasional fare who made you wonder if they were entirely human. I'd been driving the night shift on Route 47 for about 8 months. When I first encountered the passenger who paid with vintage coins, it was a Thursday night in December, around 2:15 a.m., when I saw him waiting at the Elm Street stop. He was an elderly man, maybe in his 70s, wearing a long wool coat and a fedora hat that looked like it was from the 1950s. He stood perfectly still under the bus stop light, his breath visible in the cold air. When I opened the doors, he climbed aboard slowly, using the handrail to steady himself. "Good evening," he said politely, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "One fare, please." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out exact change, 2 quarters, 2 dimes, and a nickel. The correct amount for a city bus fare. But as he dropped the coins into the fare box, I noticed something unusual. The coins looked old, much older than typical pocket change. They had the weight and appearance of silver coins from decades past. "Thank you," the man said, and took a seat about halfway back on the bus. There were only 3 other passengers on the bus at that hour. A hospital worker heading to the night shift, a young woman coming home from a restaurant job, and a college student with a backpack full of textbooks. As we continued the route, I occasionally glanced at the elderly man in the rearview mirror. He sat quietly, looking out the window at the passing cityscape, occasionally nodding to himself as if recognizing landmarks. When we reached the final stop in the industrial district, everyone got off except the elderly man. End of the line. I called back to him. He stood up slowly and walked to the front of the bus. "Thank you for the ride," he said. "It's good to see the old route is still running." He got off the bus, and I watched him walk away down the dark street until he disappeared into the shadows between the buildings. The next morning, when I turned in my fare collection, the dispatcher noticed something unusual. "Mike, where did you get these?" he asked, holding up the coins the elderly man had used to pay his fare. I looked at them more closely. They were silver quarters and dimes from the 1940s and 1950s, the kind that were 90% silver and hadn't been minted in decades. "A passenger used them to pay his fare last night," I said. "Why?" "These coins are worth way more than face value. The silver content alone makes each quarter worth about $4 or $5. This guy paid you $20 for a $2.50 bus fare." I thought about the polite elderly man and wondered why he would use valuable coins for bus fare. 3 nights later, he was waiting at the same stop, wearing the same wool coat and fedora. This time, I paid closer attention to him during the ride. He sat in the same seat and looked out the window with the same pattern of nodding and recognition. But I noticed that he seemed to be seeing things that weren't there, pointing occasionally at empty lots and commenting quietly about buildings that had been torn down years ago. "That's where Kowalski's Delicatessen used to be," I heard him say to himself. "Best pastrami in the city." When he got off at the final stop, I decided to follow him. I locked up the bus and walked in the direction he had gone, but he had vanished completely. The street was empty, with nowhere he could have gone so quickly. I started researching the history of Route 47 and the neighborhoods it served. What I discovered was a story that explained the elderly man's presence and his valuable coin payments. In 1953, a man named Joseph Kowalski had been a regular passenger on Route 47. He owned a delicatessen in the industrial district and took the bus to work every day for over 30 years. Joseph had been known for his generosity and his habit of paying for other passengers' fares when they were short on money. He always carried a pocket full of coins and would quietly help anyone who needed bus fare to get to work or get home. In February of 1983, Joseph Kowalski died of a heart attack while waiting for the bus at the Elm Street stop. He was found the next morning, still holding exact change for his fare, still waiting to go to work at the delicatessen that had been his life's work. The delicatessen closed shortly after Joseph's death, and the building was eventually torn down. For urban renewal projects, I realized that Joseph was still trying to take his daily bus ride to work, still carrying the silver coins he had accumulated over decades of taking the bus, still generous enough to overpay his fare even in death. Over the next few months, Joseph became a regular passenger on my overnight runs. Always the same stop, always the same polite greeting, always paying with valuable silver coins that were worth far more than the bus fare. But Joseph wasn't just taking the bus for himself. He was also helping other passengers, just as he had when he was alive. I started noticing that when Joseph was on the bus, other passengers' problems seemed to resolve themselves mysteriously. People who were short on fare would find extra coins in their pockets. Passengers who looked tired or stressed would suddenly seem more relaxed and optimistic. One night, a young mother got on the bus with her sick child, clearly distressed about getting to the emergency room without a car. She was crying softly, counting and recounting the small amount of money she had. I saw Joseph get up from his usual seat and walk to the front of the bus. He couldn't interact directly with the woman, but somehow her situation improved. When she reached into her purse to pay the fare, she found exact change plus extra money for a taxi from the hospital back home. "I don't understand," she said, staring at the money. "I didn't have this much when I left the house." Joseph returned to his seat with a satisfied expression, and I realized he had found a way to continue his lifetime pattern of helping people. With transportation costs, word began to spread through the late-night community about Route 47's unusual good luck. Passengers reported finding money they didn't remember having, getting help with fares when they were short, and generally having better experiences on the overnight bus runs. The route developed a reputation as the most reliable and passenger-friendly line in the city transportation system. One night, as Joseph was getting off at his usual stop, I decided to speak to him directly. "Mr. Kowalski," I said, "I know who you are, and I want you to know that I appreciate what you're doing for the other passengers." He turned back toward me with a surprised expression. "You know about the delicatessen?" he asked. "I know about your restaurant, and I know about how you used to help people with bus fare." "You're still doing that, aren't you?" Joseph smiled. "People need help getting around the city, especially at night. A bus fare might not seem like much, but sometimes it's the difference between getting home safely and being stranded. The coins you used to pay your fare are worth a lot of money," I said. "I know. I've been saving silver coins for years. Figured someday they'd be worth something. Might as well use them to help people." That was the last conversation I had with Joseph Kowalski, but he continued to ride Route 47 for the rest of my time as a night shift bus driver. I worked that route for 2 more years, and during that time, it maintained the lowest passenger complaint rate and highest satisfaction rating in the entire city transit system. When I finally transferred to a day shift position, I left detailed notes for my replacement about Joseph and his continued generosity to passengers in need. Night shift taught me that some people's kindness is so fundamental to their character that it continues even after death. Joseph Kowalski had spent his life helping people get where they needed to go, and his spirit couldn't rest while there were still people who needed transportation assistance. Every time I ride public transportation now, I think about Joseph and all the other everyday heroes who spend their lives helping strangers navigate the challenges of getting around the city. Whether they're bus drivers, passengers, or spirits who pay with silver coins, we all depend on each other to make it through the night safely. Westfield Shopping Center had been the premier retail destination in our area during the 1980s and 1990s, but by the time I started working there as a night security guard, it was showing its age. Half the storefronts were empty. The remaining businesses struggled with declining foot traffic, and the management company was considering demolition to make way for mixed-use development. My job was to patrol the mall from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., checking doors, monitoring the security cameras, and making sure no one was trying to break in or vandalize the property. Most nights, the mall was completely empty except for me and the sound of my footsteps echoing through the broad corridors. The mall had 4 main sections connected by a central court with a defunct fountain and some dying plants in large planters. Each wing had originally been anchored by a major department store, but now only one of those anchors remained open. I'd been working at Westfield for about 6 weeks. When I first encountered the shopper who never left, I was doing my 2 a.m. patrol of the north wing when I saw lights on in one of the empty storefronts. This was unusual because all the vacant stores were supposed to have their power disconnected to save on utility costs. As I got closer, I could see that the lights weren't just on. The store appeared to be fully operational. The windows displayed mannequins wearing 1980s fashions, and I could see clothing racks inside arranged as if the store was still in business. But according to my patrol logs, this storefront had been vacant for over 3 years. I tried the door, expecting it to be locked like all the other empty stores. Instead, it opened easily, and I found myself stepping into what appeared to be a fully stocked women's clothing store. The store was exactly what you would have expected to find in a 1980s mall. Bright fluorescent lighting, mirrored walls, racks of dresses with bold patterns and shoulder pads, and a sales counter with an old-fashioned cash register. And standing behind that counter, arranging accessories in a display case, was a woman in her 30s wearing a business outfit that perfectly matched the store's 1980s aesthetic. She looked up when I entered and smiled warmly. "Good evening. Welcome to Fashion Forward. Can I help you find something special tonight?" I was so surprised by her presence that it took me a moment to respond. "I'm the security guard," I finally said. "This store is supposed to be empty." She looked confused. "Empty? But we're having our biggest sale of the season. 20% off everything in the store." I looked around at the merchandise, all of which appeared to be genuine 1980s clothing in perfect condition. "What time do you close?" I asked. "We're open until 9, she said. "But I like to stay late to get ready for tomorrow's customers." The mall is so busy during the day, especially with the Christmas shopping season coming up. I glanced at my watch. It was 2:15 a.m. and Christmas was still 2 months away. "Ma'am, what year do you think it is?" she laughed. "What kind of question is that?" "It's 1987, of course." I realized I was talking to someone who had been working in this store for over 30 years without realizing that time had passed. Over the next few nights, I made a point of visiting the Fashion Forward store during my patrols. The woman, who introduced herself as Linda Patterson, was always there, always working on some aspect of store maintenance or customer preparation. Linda was enthusiastic about her job and clearly took pride in providing excellent customer service. She talked about her regular customers, her sales goals, and her plans for seasonal merchandise displays, but she also seemed unaware that the mall around her had changed dramatically since the 1980s. I started researching the history of the Fashion Forward store and its employees. What I found was both sad and touching. Linda Patterson had indeed worked at Fashion Forward from 1985 to 1987. She had been the store's assistant manager and was known for her dedication to customer service and her encyclopedic knowledge of fashion trends. In December of 1987, Linda had been working late one evening to prepare for a big holiday sale when she suffered a massive stroke and died. Alone in the store. She was found the next morning by the opening manager, Still at her post behind the sales counter, still surrounded by the Christmas merchandise she had been arranging. Fashion Forward had closed permanently after Linda's death, unable to find another employee who could match her dedication and expertise. But Linda had never realized she was dead. She had continued working in the store, night after night, for over 30 years. Once I understood Linda's situation, I started interacting with her differently. Instead of trying to convince her that she was dead or that the store was closed, I began asking her for advice about fashion and retail management. Linda was delighted to share her knowledge and experience. She gave me detailed explanations about seasonal buying, customer psychology, and effective sales techniques. But more importantly, Linda's passion for retail and customer service began to influence the struggling mall around her. I started noticing improvements in the remaining stores. Employees seemed more motivated and customer-focused. Store displays became more creative and appealing. Customer service throughout the mall improved dramatically. It was as if Linda's professional standards and enthusiasm were spreading to the other retail workers. Even though most of them couldn't see her directly, the mall's reputation began to improve. Customers who had stopped shopping there because of poor service and lackluster merchandise began returning. Vacant storefronts started attracting new tenants. One night I decided to try something different. Instead of visiting Linda alone, I brought along Maria, one of the managers from the department store that was still operating. Maria couldn't see Linda, but she could hear her voice when Linda spoke about retail strategies and customer service techniques. "That's some of the best retail advice I've ever heard," Maria said afterward. "Whoever was giving you that information really understands the business." I started facilitating these indirect consultations, bringing current mall employees to visit Fashion Forward so they could benefit from Linda's expertise. The mall's performance continued to improve. New businesses moved in, customer traffic increased, and the property management company canceled their demolition plans in favor of renovation and expansion. But the most remarkable change was in Linda herself. As the mall around her began to thrive again, Linda seemed to become more aware of the passage of time and the changes that had occurred since 1987. "The fashions are so different now," she said one night, looking at the clothing in the other stores. "Everything seems so casual. And these computers everyone carries, those are fascinating." Gradually, Linda began to understand that she had died and that the mall had changed dramatically since her time there. "I've been working here for 30 years, haven't I?" she asked one night. 30 years without a break, without a promotion, without even knowing that I died. "You've been taking care of this place," I said. "Even after death, you couldn't stop caring about retail excellence and customer service." Linda smiled. "I suppose there are worse legacies to leave behind." That night was the last time I saw Linda Patterson in Fashion Forward, but the positive changes she had brought to the mall continued. The revitalized shopping center became a model for how older retail properties could be updated and improved rather than demolished. New stores opened with an emphasis on customer service and community engagement, reflecting the values Linda had embodied during her lifetime and her decades as a ghostly consultant. I worked at Westfield Shopping Center for 2 more years, watching it transform from a dying mall into a thriving community retail center. When I finally moved on to other opportunities, I left a note for my replacement about Linda Patterson and her continued dedication to retail excellence, even after death. The night shift taught me that some people are so passionate about their work that death can't diminish their commitment to excellence. Linda Patterson had devoted her life to creating positive retail experiences, and her spirit couldn't rest while there were still opportunities to help businesses succeed and customers feel valued. Every time I walk through a shopping mall now, I think about Linda and all the other retail workers who take pride in their jobs and genuinely care about serving customers well. The night shift may be when the stores are closed, But it's also when you're most likely to encounter the spirits of people who loved their work enough to keep doing it forever. The Riverside Industrial Complex was a collection of warehouses, manufacturing facilities, and office buildings spread across 40 acres on the outskirts of the city. During the day, it employed hundreds of people in various businesses. But at night, the entire complex was my responsibility as the sole security guard. That my shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and my duties included patrolling all the buildings, checking doors and windows, monitoring the electronic security systems, and responding to any alarms or unusual activity. The complex had been built in phases over several decades, with the oldest buildings dating back to the 1940s and the newest, constructed in the early 2000s. Each building had its own character and history. But Building 7, the oldest structure on the property, was different from all the others. Building 7 had originally been a defense contractor during World War II, manufacturing components for military aircraft. It had been converted to civilian manufacturing after the war, been used for various industrial purposes over the decades. By the time I started working at Riverside, it was being used for storage and light assembly work. I'd been working the night shift at Riverside for about 3 months when I first encountered the watchman who never retired. It was a Wednesday night in September, around 1:45 a.m., when I was doing my patrol of Building 7. As I approached the main entrance, I saw a figure standing near the loading dock, wearing what appeared to be a security guard uniform from several decades past. The figure was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with gray hair and a serious expression. He was holding a flashlight and appeared to be checking the lock on one of the dock doors. "Excuse me," I called out. "Can I help you with something?" He turned toward me and touched the brim of his cap in a polite greeting. "Good evening," he said. "Just making my rounds. Everything seems secure on this side of the building." I'm the night security guard here, I said. "I don't think we've met." "Frank Wheeler," he replied, extending his hand. "I've been watching over this place since 1943. 42 years next month." I shook his hand, and his grip felt solid and real. But as I looked at him more closely, I noticed that his uniform was old-fashioned, with patches and insignia that hadn't been used by security companies in decades. "Frank, what company do you work for?" "Midwest Security Services," he said. "We've had the contract for Riverside Industrial since the war. Good people to work for. Very professional." Midwest Security Services had gone out of business in the 1980s, and Riverside Industrial had been using my company, Allied Security, for over 15 years. I realized I was talking to someone who had died years ago, but was still working his security rounds. "Frank," I said carefully, "what year do you think it is?" He looked at his watch, an old-fashioned timepiece with a leather band. 1985, he said. "Why do you ask?" I didn't have the heart to tell him he was off by more than 30 years. Over the next several weeks, I encountered Frank Wheeler regularly during my patrols of Building 7. He was always professional, always thorough, and clearly took his security responsibilities seriously. Frank would share observations about potential security vulnerabilities, mention unusual activity he'd noticed, and offer advice based on his decades of experience protecting the industrial complex. But I also started to notice that Frank's presence was having a positive effect on the security of the entire facility. Break-ins and vandalism, which had been occasional problems before I started working there, stopped completely. Equipment thefts from the outdoor storage areas ceased entirely. Even minor issues like graffiti and littering disappeared. It was as if Frank's ghostly patrols were supplementing my living security efforts, creating a level of protection that neither of us could have achieved alone. I decided to research Frank Wheeler's background and his connection to Riverside Industrial. What I discovered was a story of dedication that extended far beyond normal job requirements. Frank Wheeler had indeed worked for Midwest Security, Services from 1943 to 1985. He had been assigned to the Riverside Industrial Complex when it was still primarily a defense contractor, and he had remained at that post for his entire 42-year career. Frank had been known throughout the industrial community for his reliability and attention to detail. He had prevented numerous break-ins, caught several cases of employee theft, and had once saved the entire complex from a fire by detecting smoke during his late-night rounds. In March of 1985, Frank had suffered a heart attack while patrolling Building 7. He was found the next morning by the day shift supervisor, still carrying his flashlight and clipboard, still trying to complete his final security round. At Frank's funeral, dozens of business owners and employees from the industrial complex had spoken about his dedication and the sense of safety they felt knowing he was watching over their property. But apparently, Frank's commitment to protecting Riverside Industrial had been stronger than death. Once I understood Frank's story, I started working with him rather than around him. Instead of being startled by his appearances, I began to appreciate his additional perspective on security matters. Frank's knowledge of the complex was encyclopedic. He knew every building's history, every potential entry point, every area where problems were likely to occur. His experience and my modern equipment made us an effective team, but the most remarkable thing about Frank's ghostly presence was the way it influenced the atmosphere of the entire industrial complex. Employees who worked late or came in early began reporting that they felt safer and more secure at work. Business owners noted a dramatic decrease in security-related insurance claims. The complex developed a reputation as one of the safest and most secure industrial facilities in the area. New businesses started choosing Riverside Industrial specifically because of its excellent security record. The occupancy rate increased, and the property values improved significantly. One night, as Frank and I were completing our respective patrols, I decided to thank him for his continued service. "Frank, I want you to know that I appreciate everything you're doing to help keep this place secure. Your experience and dedication are remarkable." He smiled. "It's been my privilege to serve here for so many years. This place has been like a second home to me." "Do you ever think about retiring?" I asked. Frank was quiet for a moment. "I used to think I'd retire when I turned 65. But then, I turned 65 and the work still needed to be done. So I kept working. And then I realized that some jobs are about more than just earning a paycheck. Some jobs are about taking care of something important, being responsible for something that matters to a lot of people." Frank looked around at the quiet industrial complex, the buildings and businesses he had protected for over 4 decades. "As long as people are depending on this place for their livelihoods, someone needs to keep watch, whether I'm officially on duty or not." I worked at Riverside Industrial for 4 more years, and during that time, Frank Wheeler and I maintained an effective partnership. The complex never had a single serious security incident, and it became a model for how industrial facilities could be protected and maintained. When I finally moved on to a different position, I left detailed notes for my replacement about Frank Wheeler and his continued dedication to protecting the businesses and employees at Riverside Industrial. The night shift taught me that some people's sense of responsibility transcends death. Frank Wheeler had devoted his life to keeping people and property safe, and his spirit couldn't rest while there was still work to be done. Every time I drive past an industrial complex or office building late at night, I think about Frank and all the other security guards who work through the darkness to keep the rest of us safe. Whether they're among the living or the dead, we all depend on people who take their responsibility to protect others seriously. Because in the end, security isn't just about preventing theft or vandalism. It's about creating an environment where people can work and live without fear, where businesses can operate and grow, where communities can thrive. And sometimes, the best security guards are the ones who never clock out, never retire, and never stop caring about the people they've sworn to protect. Asterisk.